Some silences are louder than sound. Chamberlain Lake stretches across 14,000 acres of Maine's most remote wilderness, a pristine body of water that forms the heart of the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. Established in 1970, this protected corridor encompasses 92 miles of interconnected lakes, ponds, and rivers that have remained largely unchanged since the last ice age carved their boundaries into granite bedrock. The lake sits at an elevation of 910 feet above sea level, surrounded by dense boreal forest that extends unbroken to the Canadian border 40 miles north. The Allagash region carries a weight of history that predates European settlement by thousands of years. Penobscot and Maliseet tribes used these waters as thoroughfares between coastal settlements and inland hunting grounds, leaving behind petroglyphs and burial sites that archaeologists continue to discover. French fur trappers navigated these same channels in the 1600s, followed by logging companies that stripped the surrounding hills of old-growth pine and spruce through the early 1900s. By the 1980s, Chamberlain Lake had returned to something approaching its natural state. The Maine Bureau of Parks and Recreation maintained a small ranger station on the southern shore and issued fewer than 300 overnight camping permits per year. Most visitors were serious outdoorsmen, hunters, fishermen, and canoeists, seeking the kind of absolute wilderness experience that had become increasingly rare in the northeastern United States. The lake's eastern shore, in particular, remained virtually untouched, accessible only by water and consisting of steep granite cliffs that rose directly from depths exceeding 100 feet. On September 23, 1987, the morning air temperature at Chamberlain Lake registered 42 degrees Fahrenheit, with clear skies and winds from the northwest at 8 miles per hour. Weather Service records indicate typical conditions for late September. In northern Maine, crisp, stable, and ideal for fishing. 3 separate parties had chosen this date to try their luck at the lake's renowned brook trout and lake trout populations. The first group consisted of 2 brothers from Bangor, Richard and Thomas Belanger, both experienced fishermen who had been visiting Chamberlain Lake annually for over a decade. They had launched their aluminum canoe from the public boat ramp at 5:45 that morning, paddling directly to their preferred spot along the eastern shore, where underwater ledges created natural fish habitat. The second party included 3 colleagues from a Portland engineering firm, Michael Prescott, David Chen, and Jennifer Walsh, who had driven north for a long weekend of camping and fishing. They had set up their campsite on Thursday evening and were using a borrowed motorboat to explore deeper sections of the lake. The third group was a father and son team, Robert and Kevin Morin from Caribou, who had arrived at the lake before dawn specifically to target the large lake trout that fed in deep water during early morning hours. None of these 3 parties knew of the other's presence. Chamberlain Lake's size and the tendency of serious fishermen to seek isolated spots meant that encounters between different groups were uncommon. Each party had positioned themselves along the eastern shore, roughly a quarter-mile apart, focusing on areas where the bottom dropped quickly, from shallow rocky shelves to the lake's deepest sections. At approximately 9:15 that morning, all 3 groups experienced what they would later describe as the most disorienting phenomenon of their lives. The world around them simply stopped making sound. Richard Belanger later told investigators from the Maine Warden Service that he first noticed something was wrong when his brother Thomas, sitting just 4 feet away in the front of their canoe, appeared to be speaking, but produced no audible words. I could see his mouth moving, see him gesturing toward his fishing rod, but I couldn't hear anything he was saying. Belanger explained during his official interview. At first I thought something was wrong with my ears. I tried yelling his name, but I couldn't even hear my own voice. The experience described by the Portland Engineering Group proved remarkably similar. Michael Prescott reported that their boat's outboard motor, which had been idling quietly as they drifted over a promising fishing spot, appeared to continue running. Normally, they could feel the vibration through the hull and see exhaust bubbles in the water. but produced absolutely no sound. It was like someone had turned off all the audio in the world. Jennifer Walsh said, "We were all talking to each other, or trying to, but nothing carried more than maybe 2 feet. Even when David was right next to me, practically shouting in my ear, I could barely make out what he was saying." The father and son team from Caribou described the phenomenon with similar precision. Kevin Morin, who was 17 at the time, recalled the moment with unusual clarity 15 years later when contacted by a freelance journalist researching unexplained incidents in Maine's wilderness areas. "My dad and I were both casting toward this underwater ledge we knew about, and suddenly everything went quiet. Not just quiet, dead quiet. The water wasn't making any sound when our lures hit it. The wind wasn't making any sound in the trees on shore. When I reeled in my line, I couldn't hear the reel clicking. I could feel it clicking, but there was no sound." All 3 groups reported that the phenomenon lasted exactly 40 minutes. Each party independently noted the time, when the silence began 9:15 a.m. and when normal sound returned at 9:55 a.m. The precision of this timing would later become one of the most puzzling aspects of their accounts. During those 40 minutes, normal sound propagation seemed to exist within an extremely limited radius around each person. Witnesses consistently described being able to hear their own breathing and heartbeat, but nothing else. Speaking voices became audible only when the speaker's mouth was within approximately 3 feet of the listener's ear, and even then, the words sounded muffled and distant, as though filtered through heavy fabric. The phenomenon affected more than just human voices and mechanical sounds. Thomas Belanger noted that when he dropped his tackle box, the metal container hit the aluminum bottom of their canoe without producing any noise, despite the fact that this same action on any other day would create a sharp clang audible across hundreds of yards of open water. Michael Prescott's group conducted what they described as informal experiments during the event, dropping objects into the lake and clapping their hands to test whether any sounds could penetrate the apparent acoustic barrier surrounding them. Nothing worked. Perhaps most disturbing was the effect on natural sounds that the fishermen had unconsciously relied upon to navigate and understand their environment. The gentle lapping of small waves against canoe hulls, the rustle of wind through pine and birch leaves on shore, the distant cry of loons that typically echoed across the lake's surface. All of these familiar audio cues simply disappeared. Several witnesses described feeling profoundly disoriented, as though they had been transported to an alien landscape that merely resembled the place they knew. When normal sound returned at 9:55, the transition was immediate and complete. Richard Belanger described it as like someone suddenly turned the volume back up on the world. Within seconds, all the familiar sounds of the wilderness environment had returned. Wind in the trees, water moving against shoreline rocks, the distant call of a red-winged blackbird, and the low hum of insects that had apparently been active throughout the 40-minute silence but completely inaudible. The 3 groups of fishermen did not encounter each other during their time on the lake, and each returned to civilization with their own private version of an inexplicable experience. It was only when Richard Belanger mentioned the incident to a friend who worked for the Maine Bureau of Parks and Recreation that the similarities between the 3 accounts began to emerge. The friend, a veteran ranger named William Cote, had heard unusual stories from the Allagash region before. He made informal inquiries and discovered that the Portland Engineering Group had filed a brief incident report with the local warden service, more out of curiosity than concern. Cote then tracked down the Morin family and learned that they too had experienced something extraordinary on September 23rd. Cote compiled the 3 accounts into an unofficial report that he submitted to his supervisors at the State Parks Bureau. The response was swift and unambiguous. No investigation would be conducted, and no official documentation of the incident would be created. When Cote pressed for an explanation, he was told that isolated acoustic anomalies occasionally occurred in wilderness areas due to unusual atmospheric conditions, and that such phenomena were not considered a public safety concern. This explanation satisfied none of the witnesses. Robert Morin, who had spent 30 years hunting and fishing in northern Maine, contacted the National Weather Service to inquire about atmospheric conditions that might create the kind of acoustic isolation his group had experienced. A meteorologist from the Gray, Maine Forecast Office reviewed weather data from September 23rd and found nothing unusual standard high-pressure conditions, with light winds and clear skies that would normally enhance rather than inhibit sound transmission across open water. Michael Prescott's engineering background led him to research similar phenomena in scientific literature. He found references to acoustic shadows created by atmospheric temperature inversions, but these typically affected specific frequency ranges rather than all sound, and they occurred over much larger geographic areas. Nothing in the published research matched the precise, localized, and time-limited experience reported by the three fishing parties. Jennifer Walsh, the only member of the Portland group with a background in physics, conducted her own analysis of the incident. She calculated that for sound to be completely absorbed or deflected in such a localized area would require either an unknown atmospheric phenomenon or the presence of materials with acoustic properties unlike anything found in natural environments. Her informal report, distributed among colleagues at the University of Maine, generated interest from researchers in the physics department, but no formal study was ever undertaken. In 1991, a graduate student in atmospheric sciences at the University of Maine attempted to investigate acoustic anomalies in the Allagash region as part of a thesis project on unusual weather phenomena. The student, whose name was not made public, reportedly spent several weeks conducting interviews with park rangers, wardens, and longtime residents of the area. According to sources familiar with the project, the student discovered at least 6 other incidents of unexplained acoustic phenomena in the Chamberlain Lake area between 1975 and 1990. The thesis was never completed. The student transferred to another university before the end of the academic year, and all research materials related to the project disappeared from university files. Attempts by other researchers to contact the former student through alumni networks have been unsuccessful. In 2003, a freelance journalist named Sarah Hendricks began investigating unexplained phenomena in Maine's wilderness areas for a proposed magazine article. Her research included extensive interviews with the original witnesses from the Chamberlain Lake incident, as well as current and former Park Service employees. Hendricks reported that several longtime rangers acknowledged hearing similar stories from visitors over the years, but none had been officially documented. Hendricks's investigation revealed that the Maine Bureau of Parks and Recreation had quietly installed acoustic monitoring equipment at 3 locations around Chamberlain Lake in 1994. The stated purpose was wildlife research, but the equipment was positioned in areas not known for significant animal activity. When Hendricks submitted Freedom of Information Act requests for data collected by this equipment, she was told that no records existed of the monitoring program. The monitors themselves were removed sometime between 2001 and 2003, with no documentation of who authorized the removal or where the equipment was relocated. Today, Chamberlain Lake appears on maps and in guidebooks as one of Maine's premier wilderness fishing destinations. The lake's eastern shore, where 3 groups of fishermen experienced 40 minutes of inexplicable silence in 1987, remains largely unchanged. Park Service records show no unusual incident reports from the area, and the official history of the Allagash Wilderness Waterway makes no mention of acoustic anomalies or unexplained phenomena. On quiet mornings in late September, when atmospheric conditions match those of September 23, 1987, some fishermen still avoid the eastern shore of Chamberlain Lake, not because they fear anything supernatural or dangerous, but because they understand that some silences are deeper than others, and that not every mystery requires an explanation to remain true. Some patterns reveal themselves only to those who wait. Beehive Mountain rises 520 feet above the rocky coastline of Mount Desert Island, forming one of Acadia National Park's most recognizable landmarks. Named for its distinctive dome-shaped summit that resembles a massive stone beehive when viewed from Bar Harbor, the mountain consists primarily of pink Cadillac granite formed during the Devonian period over 400 million years ago. The same geological forces that created the granite peaks throughout Acadia also left behind countless loose stones and boulders scattered across the mountain's slopes and summit area. The mountain's hiking trail, known as the Beehive Trail, gained notoriety among experienced climbers for its exposed cliff faces and iron-rung sections that require both technical skill and considerable nerve. Park Service records indicate that the trail was first established in 1915 by path builders working under the direction of George Dorr, Acadia's first superintendent. The summit area, roughly circular and spanning approximately 50 yards in diameter, offers panoramic views of Frenchman Bay and the surrounding islands that have attracted visitors for over a century. What makes Beehive Mountain unique among Acadia's peaks, however, has nothing to do with its geology or scenic vistas. Hidden among the scattered granite debris near the summit's eastern edge lies a phenomenon that park officials have quietly monitored for more than 6 decades, but never publicly acknowledged. The discovery occurred on August 14, 1962, when Park Ranger James Mackenzie was conducting a routine trail maintenance inspection on Beehive Mountain. Mackenzie, a 28-year veteran of the Park Service, had climbed the Beehive Trail countless times and was intimately familiar with every feature of the summit area. On this particular morning, however, he noticed something that had not been present during his previous visit just 5 days earlier. 17 granite stones, each roughly the size of a basketball and remarkably uniform in shape, had been arranged in a perfect circle approximately 12 feet in diameter near the summit's highest point. The stones themselves appeared to be ordinary Cadillac granite, consistent with the mountain's geological composition, but their arrangement was unmistakably deliberate. More puzzling still, the stones bore carved markings, numbers, and symbols that had been etched into their surfaces with precision that suggested professional tool work rather than casual vandalism. Mackenzie's initial assumption was that visitors had created an unauthorized stone circle, possibly for ceremonial purposes or as an elaborate practical joke. Vandalism of this type, while uncommon in Acadia, was not unprecedented. What troubled Mackenzie was the quality of the carved markings, which appeared to have been weathered by decades of exposure despite the fact that the arrangement was clearly new. The ranger photographed the stone circle and filed a routine incident report with park headquarters, recommending that the unauthorized installation be dismantled and the stones scattered to prevent the site from becoming an attraction for future vandalism. Park officials approved the recommendation, and on August 16th, Mackenzie returned to the summit with 2 other rangers to remove the stone circle. The stones were gone. In their place, the same 17 granite stones had been rearranged into 3 parallel lines, each stone now displaying different numerical markings than those Mackenzie had photographed just 2 days earlier. The new arrangement formed what appeared to be a date, 8/16/1969. The significance of this particular date would not become apparent until 7 years later, when a devastating fire swept through the Beehive Trail area on August 16, 1969, requiring the trail to be closed for extensive repairs and habitat restoration. Park Ranger Patricia Williams first recognized the pattern in 1975, after 13 years of sporadic documentation had accumulated in Acadia's incident files. Williams, who had been assigned to review historical trail maintenance records as part of a park-wide safety assessment, noticed that the stone arrangements consistently displayed dates that occurred exactly 7 years after they were first observed. More disturbing was her realization that every date represented by the stones had corresponded to a significant event affecting Beehive Mountain or the immediate surrounding area. The August 16, 1969 fire was only the beginning. Stone arrangements photographed in 1970 displayed the date September 3, 1977, the day that Hurricane Donna's remnants caused severe erosion damage to the Beehive Trail. An arrangement documented in 1974 showed May 22, 1981, which proved to be the date that a rockfall closed the trail's most technical section for 6 months. The pattern continued with unsettling consistency through the 1970s and into the 1980s. Williams shared her findings with Park Superintendent Robert Hayes in a confidential memorandum dated March 19, 1975. Hayes, a career Park Service administrator who had overseen operations at Acadia since 1967, was initially skeptical of what he termed coincidental date clusters. However, when Williams presented photographic evidence showing that stone arrangements from 1972 had accurately predicted the date of a serious climbing accident on the Beehive Trail 7 years later, Hayes authorized a discreet investigation. The investigation, conducted by Rangers Williams and David Chen over the summer of 1975, established several key facts about the stone arrangements. First, the 17 stones never varied in number, size, or basic composition. Laboratory analysis of granite samples confirmed that all 17 stones originated from the same geological formation as Beehive Mountain itself. Second, the arrangements changed only during overnight periods when the summit area was unoccupied. Third, despite the installation of trail cameras and motion sensors beginning in 1976, no human presence had ever been detected during the rearrangement process. Perhaps most significantly, the dates displayed by the stones proved to be accurate predictors of events affecting the mountain with a precision that defied statistical probability. Chen, who held a degree in mathematics from the University of Maine, calculated that the likelihood of 17 random date predictions being accurate over a 13-year period was less than 1 in several million. Former park ranger Michael Torres, who worked at Acadia from 1978 to 1994, later described the stone arrangements as the worst-kept secret in the Park Service. Torres explained that while the phenomenon was never discussed in official reports or staff meetings, most long-term employees were aware of its existence and had developed informal protocols for monitoring and documenting the arrangements. Every ranger who worked the Beehive area knew about the stones, Torres said during a 1998 interview with a freelance journalist investigating unusual phenomena in national parks. We'd check them maybe once a week, take photographs if they'd changed, and file the pictures in a folder that officially didn't exist. The understanding was that we were documenting a natural curiosity, not investigating anything supernatural or unexplainable. Torres described several incidents that reinforced the predictive accuracy of the stone arrangements. In 1983, the stones displayed the date July 14, 1990, which corresponded exactly with a severe lightning strike that damaged the summit's weather monitoring equipment 7 years later. An arrangement photographed in 1985 showed October 9, 1992, the date that an unexpected early snowfall stranded 12 hikers on the Beehive Trail, requiring a complex rescue operation. The most unsettling incident occurred in 1987, when the stones arranged themselves to display December 21, 1994. Torres and his colleagues interpreted this as a prediction of winter weather events or seasonal trail closures. Instead, December 21, 1994, proved to be the day that Park Ranger Sarah Hendricks disappeared while conducting a solo inspection of the Beehive Trail. Despite extensive search efforts involving multiple agencies and volunteer organizations, Hendricks was never found. The case remains open but inactive in Park Service files. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a geologist from the University of Maine, who conducted an unofficial study of the Beehive Mountain phenomenon in 1989, approached the stone arrangements from a scientific perspective that focused on geological rather than predictive aspects. Morrison's research funded through a small grant from the Maine Geological Survey, examined whether natural processes could explain the movement and rearrangement of the stones. I was initially interested in freeze-thaw cycles and how they might cause large stones to shift position over time, Morrison explained in her preliminary report. What I found instead was evidence of deliberate placement that could not be explained by any known natural process. The stones show no signs of rolling or sliding. They appear to be lifted and positioned with considerable precision. Morrison's study documented several physical anomalies associated with the stone arrangements. Soil samples collected from beneath the stones showed compression patterns consistent with the stones having been in their current positions for years, despite photographic evidence that they had been rearranged just days earlier. Ground-penetrating radar revealed no underground spaces or cavities that might explain how the stones were being moved without surface detection. Most significantly, Morrison discovered that the carved numerical markings on the stones exhibited weathering patterns that suggested exposure to environmental conditions for decades. Regardless of when the markings had first been observed, it was as if each new arrangement had always existed, Morrison wrote in her final report. The weathering was consistent with stones that had been exposed to Maine coastal conditions for 20 to 30 years, but we were documenting arrangements that appeared overnight. Morrison's research was terminated abruptly in 1990 when the National Park Service denied her request to renew permits for continued study. Her final report was classified as preliminary and never submitted for peer review or publication. Attempts to contact Morrison for follow-up interviews have been unsuccessful, and the University of Maine has no record of her current whereabouts. In 1991, the Park Service installed a permanent security camera system focused specifically on the Stone Circle area. The cameras, described in official documents as wildlife monitoring equipment, operated continuously for over 3 years without recording any human activity during periods when the stones were known to have been rearranged. Technical analysis of the footage revealed several unexplained anomalies, including periodic signal interruptions that lasted exactly 47 minutes and consistently occurred during overnight hours when stone arrangements were later discovered to have changed. The camera system was removed in 1994 without explanation. Park Service records indicate only that the equipment was reassigned to other monitoring priorities and provide no details about where the cameras were relocated or what analysis was conducted on the collected footage. Current park officials declined to comment on the Beehive Mountain stone arrangements, describing them as unsubstantiated visitor reports that fall outside the scope of normal Park Service documentation. Access to the summit area has been quietly restricted since 1995, with the Beehive Trail officially rated as expert only and subject to seasonal closures that often extend well beyond periods of dangerous weather conditions. Despite these restrictions, occasional hikers continue to report encounters with the stone arrangements. Social media posts and hiking forum discussions from the past decade describe numerical configurations that maintain the same 7-year predictive pattern, documented by park rangers for over 4 decades. Recent stone arrangements have reportedly displayed dates extending into the 2030s, suggesting events that remain decades in the future. The 17 stones continue their silent countdown on Beehive Mountain summit, marking time with a precision that no human calendar can match. Park Service records show no official acknowledgement of their existence, but unofficial documentation persists in folders and files that accumulate dust in unmarked cabinets. Some patterns require patience to understand, and some mysteries reveal their nature only to those willing to wait 7 years for confirmation. Sometimes, the most disturbing sounds are the ones that aren't there. Rangeley Lake stretches across 16 square miles of western Maine's mountainous wilderness, its dark waters reaching depths of 144 feet at the center of what geologists call a glacial kettle lake. formed during the last ice age when a massive chunk of glacial ice melted in place. The lake sits at an elevation of 1,546 feet above sea level, surrounded by peaks that rise another 2,000 feet into the thin mountain air. The Rangeley chain of lakes, including Moosilauke-Miguntic, Richardson, and Umbagog, forms the headwaters of the Androscoggin River system, a network of interconnected waterways that has served as a transportation corridor for over 8,000 years. The region's isolation has always been both its defining characteristic and its protection. Native American tribes, primarily the Abenaki, used the lake system as seasonal fishing grounds, but maintained no permanent settlements in the harsh mountain environment. European loggers arrived in the 1840s, stripping the surrounding hills of old-growth pine and spruce. But the industry abandoned the area by 1900, when the most accessible timber had been harvested. By the 1970s, Rangeley Lake had returned to something approaching its natural state, a deep, cold body of water surrounded by regenerating forest, and accessible only by a handful of logging roads that deteriorated with each passing winter. This isolation made Rangeley Lake an ideal location for the kind of sensitive acoustic research that required absolute quiet and minimal human interference. The lake's depth and steep underwater topography created unique sound propagation characteristics that attracted researchers studying everything from fish behavior to underwater acoustics for military applications. Dr. Margaret Chen, a marine acoustics specialist at the University of Maine, selected Rangeley Lake as the primary research site for her National Science Foundation-funded study of ambient underwater noise patterns in northern New England lake systems. Chen's research, titled Baseline Acoustic Mapping of Glacial Lake Environments, was designed to establish reference recordings of natural underwater soundscapes before increasing development and recreational use altered these pristine environments. The research team arrived at Rangeley Lake on June 15, 1974, and established a temporary field station on the lake's northeastern shore. The team consisted of Chen, graduate student Thomas Westbrook, and acoustic technician Daniel Morrison, who had borrowed specialized hydrophone equipment from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Their plan called for continuous underwater recording at multiple depths over a 6-week period, with particular focus on the lake's deepest section, where thermal layers created complex acoustic environments. The recording equipment consisted of 4 hydrophones suspended at depths of 20, 40, 80, and 120 feet, connected to surface recording devices that captured sound across a wide frequency spectrum. The system operated continuously, 24 hours per day, accumulating what Chen described as the most comprehensive acoustic profile ever attempted of a deep freshwater environment in the northeastern United States. For the first 3 weeks, the recordings captured exactly what Chen had expected: the subtle sounds of a healthy lake ecosystem. Fish movements created brief clicking and rustling noises. Thermal currents produced low-frequency rumbles as water masses of different temperatures shifted position. Occasional surface disturbances from wind or wildlife registered as brief spikes in the acoustic data. The recordings provided a detailed audio portrait of Rangeley Lake's natural rhythms. On July 8, 1974, the pattern changed. Westbrook, who was responsible for daily review of the previous day's recordings, noticed something unusual in the overnight data from the deepest hydrophone. Rather than the consistent low-level ambient noise that had characterized the previous weeks, the recording showed periods of complete silence lasting exactly 47 seconds, followed by periods of normal ambient sound lasting exactly 93 seconds. The pattern repeated without variation for over 6 hours. Chen initially suspected equipment malfunction. The team spent 2 days testing and recalibrating the hydrophone system, but found no technical problems. When the recordings resumed on July 10th, the same pattern appeared again: 47 seconds of complete acoustic silence, followed by 93 seconds of normal underwater sounds. The cycle repeated with mathematical precision throughout the night, then stopped abruptly at dawn. Morrison, whose background included acoustic work for the Navy's submarine detection programs, recognized something significant about the timing intervals. 47 and 93 are both prime numbers, and their ratio creates what acousticians call a non-harmonic relationship that rarely occurs in natural sound patterns. More disturbing was his realization that the silent periods represented not an absence of recording, but an absence of sound itself, as if something was absorbing or blocking every source of underwater noise across a large area. The team expanded their monitoring efforts, deploying additional hydrophones at various depths and locations around the lake. The results were consistent. The structured silence pattern occurred only at the lake's deepest point and only during overnight hours between approximately 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. During these periods, all ambient underwater noise, fish movements, thermal currents, even the subtle sounds of microscopic biological activity, simply stopped for exactly 47 seconds at a time. Chen documented the phenomenon in her daily research log, with the clinical precision of a scientist confronting something outside her experience. The silence periods represent complete acoustic isolation, she wrote on July 18, 1974. All hydrophones positioned below 80 feet register zero ambient noise during these intervals. Surface hydrophones continue to record normal environmental sounds, suggesting the phenomenon is localized to the lake's deeper waters. Graduate student Westbrook approached the mystery from a mathematical perspective, analyzing the timing patterns for any underlying structure that might explain their origin. His calculations revealed that the 47 and 93-second intervals, when combined in sequence, created longer patterns that repeated every 3 hours and 26 minutes. More significantly, these longer patterns aligned with astronomical phenomena, specifically the lake's position relative to celestial objects that would be directly overhead during the silence periods. It's as if something is responding to astronomical timing, Westbrook wrote in his thesis notes. The patterns correlate with the positions of specific star formations that would be visible directly above the lake during the silence events. But correlation isn't causation, and I can't conceive of any physical mechanism that would link stellar positions to underwater acoustics. Morrison's interpretation was more unsettling. His Navy experience had taught him to recognize artificial sound patterns created by human technology, and he insisted that the Rangeley recordings exhibited characteristics consistent with active sonar blocking sophisticated electronic countermeasures designed to mask the acoustic signature of submerged objects. Something down there is creating a sound shadow, Morrison told Chen during a recorded interview in late July. Every 47 seconds, all natural noise stops completely. That doesn't happen in nature. That happens when something very large moves into position to block acoustic transmission across a wide area. The team's final week at Rangeley Lake produced the most comprehensive documentation of the phenomenon. 18 hours of continuous structured silence, recorded across multiple hydrophones and analyzed in real time, revealed additional patterns within the larger timing sequence. The 47-second silence periods were not uniform. They contained what Chen described as micro-variations that suggested complex internal structure. When the acoustic data was converted to visual representations, the patterns resembled linguistic elements, repetitions, variations, and rhythmic structures that appeared almost grammatical in their organization. Chen submitted her preliminary findings to the National Science Foundation on August 20, 1974, along with a request for extended funding to continue research into what she termed unknown acoustic phenomena in deep freshwater environments. The NSF response was swift and definitive. Funding for the project would not be renewed, and all research materials were to be transferred to federal archives for security review. The original recording equipment was collected by representatives from an unidentified federal agency on September 3, 1974. Chen, Westbrook, and Morrison were required to sign non-disclosure agreements that prohibited them from discussing their findings with colleagues, media, or other researchers. The agreements remained in effect for 2 years and included provisions for criminal prosecution if violated. When the non-disclosure period expired in 1976, Chen attempted to retrieve her research materials from federal archives. She was informed that no records of the Rangeley Lake project existed in any federal database. The original tape recordings, field notes, and acoustic analysis reports had been permanently classified under provisions of the National Security Act. Even the copies that Chen had maintained in her university office were removed without explanation while she was attending a conference in Boston. Dr. James Sullivan, who served as department head for marine sciences at the University of Maine during the 1970s, later confirmed that the Rangeley Lake research had been administratively terminated following federal intervention. Sullivan declined to provide specific details, but acknowledged that unusual findings had attracted the attention of agencies outside normal academic circles. Margaret Chen was a respected scientist, conducting legitimate research, Sullivan said during a 1985 interview. What happened to her work at Rangeley was unprecedented in my 40 years in academic research. Thomas Westbrook completed his graduate degree using alternative research data, but his thesis committee refused to approve any mention of the Rangeley Lake findings. Westbrook left academic research shortly after graduation and moved to private industry, where he has declined all requests for interviews about his summer at the lake. Daniel Morrison returned to Navy acoustic research and was transferred to classified projects that precluded any discussion of his civilian work. Chen continued her career in marine acoustics, but never again attempted research into unexplained underwater phenomena. In a brief statement to a science journalist in 1989, she described the Rangeley Lake project as the most significant discovery of my career and the one I'm least able to discuss. Chen died in 2006, and her personal papers, donated to the University of Maine archives, contain no materials related to her work at Rangeley Lake. Independent researchers have made several attempts to replicate Chen's findings at Rangeley Lake, but access to the deepest sections has been restricted since 1978 under provisions of state environmental protection laws. The stated reason for these restrictions is preservation of sensitive aquatic habitats, but no biological surveys supporting this designation have been made public. Sonar mapping of the lake's deepest areas is specifically prohibited, and recreational diving below 50 feet requires permits that are rarely granted. Local residents of the Rangeley area occasionally report unusual sounds coming from the lake during quiet summer nights. Not the structured silence that Chen's team documented, but rhythmic pulses that seem to emanate from deep water. These reports are not investigated by state environmental authorities, and they appear in no official databases or incident logs. The patterns that Margaret Chen recorded beneath Rangeley Lake continue to pulse in archived memory, mathematical sequences that once suggested language from something that preferred the dark. The original tapes may be gone, but the questions they raised remain suspended in the deep water of institutional silence, waiting for someone willing to listen to what the lake was trying to say. Light has its own language in deep water, and some conversations were never meant to be overheard. Moosehead Lake spans 75 square miles across central Maine's Piscataquis County, making it the largest lake entirely within the state's borders. The lake reaches depths of 246 feet at its center, where cold water preserves the remnants of ancient forests that were flooded when the Kennebec River was dammed in 1838. These submerged tree trunks, known locally as deadheads, create an underwater landscape of shadows and structures that has claimed dozens of boats over the past century and a half. The lake's name derives from an island near its center that, when viewed from the southern shore, resembles the head and antlers of a massive moose. Mount Kineo, a sheer cliff of flint that rises 800 feet directly from the water, dominates the lake's eastern shore and has served as a navigation landmark for thousands of years. The Penobscot tribe considered Kineo sacred, believing the mountain's unusual geology, a formation of hornfells created by ancient volcanic activity, held spiritual significance that extended deep into the surrounding waters. European settlers arrived in the early 1800s, drawn by the region's timber resources and the lake's strategic position along transportation routes between the coast and Canada. Logging operations transformed Moosehead Lake into a major industrial waterway, with steam-powered vessels hauling millions of board feet of lumber to mills downstream. By the early 1900s, however, the most accessible timber had been harvested, and the lake gradually returned to its role as a destination for fishing and recreation. This transition from industrial use to wilderness recreation coincided with the first documented reports of unusual lights beneath the lake's surface. Local fishing guides, who knew Moosehead's waters better than anyone, began describing coordinated light patterns that appeared during early morning and late evening hours, when surface conditions were calm. The earliest detailed account appears in the journal of Walter Morrison, a fishing guide who worked the lake from 1922 to 1967. Morrison's entry for September 14, 1943, describes an encounter that established the pattern for hundreds of similar reports over the following decades. 3 lights appeared beneath my boat at approximately 6:30 this morning, each the size of a dinner plate and glowing with steady white illumination. The lights maintained perfect triangular formation as they moved along the underwater contours of Morrison Point, following the 10-fathom line with precision that no fish or natural phenomenon could explain. Duration, approximately 12 minutes. Lights dimmed gradually and disappeared simultaneously when they reached the deep channel near Kineo. Morrison's account established several key characteristics that would be consistently reported by witnesses over the next 8 decades. The lights always appeared in groups of 3, maintaining geometric spacing that suggested coordination rather than random biological activity. They followed specific underwater topographic features, ridges, drop-offs, and channels with navigation accuracy that implied detailed knowledge of the lake's submerged terrain. Most significantly, the lights demonstrated behaviors that defied explanation through conventional understanding of aquatic life or natural phenomena. Robert Chen, a marine biology professor from the University of Maine who studied Moosehead Lake's ecosystem during the 1970s, documented over 40 separate light sightings between 1973 and 1978. Chen's research, originally focused on the lake's brook trout and lake trout populations, gradually shifted toward investigating what he termed anomalous bioluminescent activity in the lake's deeper waters. The lights exhibit characteristics unlike any known bioluminescent organism, Chen wrote in his 1976 research summary. They maintain consistent brightness over extended periods, show no variation in intensity or color temperature, and demonstrate coordinated movement patterns that suggest complex behavioral organization. Most importantly, they appear at depths and temperatures where bioluminescent activity should not occur in freshwater environments. Chen's attempts to document the lights using underwater photography yielded inconclusive results. Photographs taken during reported sighting periods showed only dark water, despite multiple witnesses confirming the presence of lights at the same time and location. However, Chen's underwater light meters registered significant illumination spikes during these periods, indicating that light was present even though photographic equipment failed to record it. Local fishing guide Thomas Belanger, who worked Moosehead Lake for over 30 years, described the light's behavioral patterns with the precision of someone who had observed them hundreds of times. They follow routes, Belanger explained during a 1981 interview with a regional fishing magazine. The lights know where they're going. They'll move along the eastern shore from Kineo, toward northeast Cary, staying in water between 60 and 80 feet deep. Sometimes they'll circle back on themselves, creating patterns that look almost like search grids. But they're searching for something specific, because they'll stop at certain spots and hover for 5 or 10 minutes before moving on. Boulanger's observations revealed additional disturbing details about the light's behavior. They appeared most frequently during periods of barometric pressure change, often hours before weather fronts arrived in the area. The lights also showed seasonal patterns, with peak activity occurring during spring and fall periods when water temperatures created distinct thermal layers in the lake's deeper sections. Perhaps most unsettling was Boulanger's account of the light's apparent awareness of surface activity. "They know when boats are above them," he said. "I've seen them change direction to avoid areas where there's heavy boat traffic, and they'll disappear completely if anyone tries to get directly above them with diving equipment. It's like they're monitoring the surface and making decisions about when it's safe to move." Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a geophysicist who conducted an unofficial study of Moosehead Lake's anomalies in 1979, approached the phenomenon from a different perspective. Morrison's interest was sparked by reports that the light's movements corresponded with subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field, measured by sensitive instruments at the University of Maine's physics department. "I found correlations between reported light activity and magnetic field fluctuations that were statistically significant," Morrison explained in her preliminary report. The lights appeared to respond to geomagnetic changes that preceded their sightings by approximately 18 to 24 hours. This suggested either a natural phenomenon linked to electromagnetic activity or something artificial that was monitoring and responding to environmental conditions. Morrison's research was terminated abruptly when she applied for funding to install permanent monitoring equipment in the lake. The Maine Department of Environmental Protection denied her permit application, citing concerns about disturbing sensitive aquatic habitats. When Morrison appealed this decision, she was informed that several areas of Moosehead Lake had been designated as restricted zones, where scientific research required special federal clearance that could take years to obtain. The restricted zones corresponded exactly with the locations where light activity had been most frequently reported. State records show that diving permits for Moosehead Lake became significantly more difficult to obtain beginning in 1983. Applications for deep water diving in the lake's central and eastern sections were routinely denied, with applicants told that underwater conditions posed unacceptable safety risks due to submerged debris and unstable thermal layers. Commercial diving operations were prohibited entirely in areas where the lights had been most commonly observed. Michael Torres, a commercial diver who had worked on boat recovery operations in Moosehead Lake during the 1970s, attempted to continue his salvage business after the restrictions were implemented. Torres found that his permit applications were rejected even for shallow water operations in areas where he had previously worked without incident. "They told me the lake had become too dangerous for diving operations," Torres said during a 1992 interview. "But I'd been diving those waters for 15 years, and nothing had changed except the bureaucracy. The real problem was that I'd seen things down there that someone didn't want documented. Lights that moved with purpose, geometric patterns carved into the lake bottom in areas where no human activity should have been possible, and equipment that looked like nothing I'd ever seen before." Torres's description of geometric patterns carved into the lake bottom was corroborated by other divers who had worked in the area before restrictions were implemented. These patterns, described as precise circles and straight lines etched into the sediment, appeared in water depths between 100 and 150 feet, primarily in areas where light activity was most frequently reported. Sonar mapping of Moosehead Lake, conducted by the Maine Geological Survey in 1985, revealed several anomalous features on the lake bottom that did not correspond to known geological formations or human-made structures. The survey report, heavily redacted when released through Freedom of Information Act requests, describes artificial appearing geometric structures at depths exceeding 200 feet. The original sonar data files were classified and remain unavailable to researchers. Current lake regulations prohibit sonar mapping by private individuals and restrict boat traffic in several areas during specific time periods. These restrictions are officially described as wildlife protection measures, but no biological surveys supporting these designations have been made public. The restricted areas and time periods correspond closely with historical patterns of light activity reported by fishermen and guides. Local fishing guides who continue to work Moosehead Lake report that light sightings have become less frequent since the restrictions were implemented, but they have not stopped entirely. The lights now appear primarily in areas where surface observation is difficult due to shoreline terrain or restricted access. When sightings do occur, they follow the same patterns documented over the past 8 decades. Groups of 3 lights moving in geometric formation along specific underwater contours. Recent reports suggest that the lights have adapted their behavior to avoid areas with heavy recreational boat traffic, appearing instead in remote sections of the lake during early morning hours when human activity is minimal. This behavioral change implies a level of environmental awareness that challenges conventional understanding of what the lights might be. The geometry continues beneath Moosehead's dark water, 3 points of light following ancient paths through submerged forests, where dead trees stand like sentinels in the cold depths. The lights maintain their formations with mathematical precision, suggesting purpose that human observers can document but never fully understand. Some patterns are too perfect to be natural, and some lights too coordinated to be random, leaving witnesses to wonder what intelligence guides their movement through the underwater darkness. Sometimes, the ocean forgets how to speak its own name. Thunder Hole cuts into the pink granite coastline of Mount Desert Island like a perfectly engineered acoustic chamber. Its narrow inlet and underground cavern system creating one of nature's most reliable sound phenomena. Located along the ocean path in Acadia National Park, this geological formation has drawn visitors since the late 1800s, when wealthy summer residents first discovered that incoming waves produced thunderous booms audible from over a mile away. The sound occurs when waves surge into the inlet's narrow opening and compress air within the subterranean chamber, forcing it to escape through cracks in the granite ceiling with explosive force. The formation's acoustics are so consistent that park rangers use Thunder Hole as an informal weather gauge. The intensity and frequency of the booms correlate directly with wave height, tidal conditions, and barometric pressure. During optimal conditions, incoming tide, with waves between 4 and 6 feet in height, Thunder Hole produces its signature sound every 12 to 15 seconds with mechanical precision. Marine geologists have studied the formation extensively, confirming that its acoustic properties result from a unique combination of inlet geometry, chamber volume, and granite density that creates what acousticians call a natural amplification system. This predictability makes the periodic silence all the more disturbing. The Wabanaki tribes, who inhabited Mount Desert Island for thousands of years, had specific warnings about Thunder Hole during certain atmospheric conditions. According to ethnographic records compiled by anthropologist Frank Speck in 1914, tribal elders described periods when the stone voice sleeps and speaks in tongues of the deep-water spirits. These accounts, dismissed by early park officials as folklore, described phenomena remarkably similar to what modern visitors continue to experience. The first documented gap event in park records occurred on July 23, 1956, when park naturalist Robert Chen was conducting a guided tour for 37 visitors from the Bar Harbor area. Chen, who had worked at Thunder Hole for 8 years and knew its acoustic patterns intimately, was demonstrating the formation's predictable sound production when the phenomenon abruptly changed character. The waves were perfect for thunder production, Chen wrote in his incident report. 6-foot swells at incoming tide, exactly the conditions that normally produce the loudest booms. But when the wave surge entered the inlet, instead of the expected thunder, we heard only a soft, hissing sound, like air escaping from a punctured tire. The tourists were disappointed, but I was disturbed. In 8 years of working this site, I had never heard Thunderhole fail to produce sound under optimal conditions. Chen's report, filed with park headquarters on July 24th, noted additional anomalies during the 40-minute period when normal acoustic function was absent. Visitors who spoke loudly near the formation reported that their voices echoed back as different words, consistently in what sounded like Native American languages. Several tourists mentioned feeling disoriented and asked Chen if the Park Service was broadcasting recorded sounds from hidden speakers. More unsettling was Chen's observation that during the Gap event, the granite walls of Thunderhole felt noticeably warmer to the touch than normal, despite consistent air and water temperatures. Infrared temperature readings taken the following day showed no thermal anomalies, but Chen's written notes described granite surfaces that were uncomfortably warm, almost feverish, during the silence period. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, an acoustics researcher from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, investigated Thunderhole's anomalous behavior during the summer of 1958. Sullivan's research, funded by a National Science Foundation grant studying natural acoustic phenomena, documented 3 separate gap events over a 6-week period. Her findings challenged conventional understanding of how sound propagation works in geological formations. The acoustic failure isn't caused by changes in wave conditions or chamber geometry, Sullivan wrote in her preliminary report. During gap events, sound waves appear to be absorbed or redirected by unknown means. My equipment registered normal wave energy entering the chamber, but the acoustic output measured near 0 decibels. It's as if the granite temporarily acquired sound dampening properties that don't exist under normal conditions. Sullivan's research revealed that gap events occurred most frequently during periods of specific atmospheric pressure ranges, always between 29.8 and 30.1 inches of mercury. More significantly, her analysis of tidal data showed that gap events coincided with astronomical configurations when the moon was at specific positions relative to the Earth-Sun system, suggesting a gravitational component to the phenomenon. Local resident Thomas Morrison, whose family had operated a fishing guide service in the Bar Harbor area since 1920, described gap events with the precision of someone who had observed them for decades. My father first told me about the silent times at Thunder Hole in the 1930s, Morrison explained during a 1972 interview with a regional magazine. He said you could tell when it was going to happen because the seabirds would stop calling about an hour beforehand. The whole area would get quiet, like everything was listening for something. Morrison's account included details that park officials had not documented in their incident reports. During gap events, he observed that compass needles would deflect slightly when held near Thunderhole, pointing approximately 15 degrees east of magnetic north. This deflection lasted only as long as the acoustic anomaly, returning to normal when Thunderhole resumed its typical sound production. Perhaps most disturbing was Morrison's description of the language echoes that multiple witnesses had reported. People would call out to test the echo, and they'd hear their voices come back saying different words, Morrison said. But the strange part was that visitors often claimed they understood what the echoes were saying, even though they didn't recognize the language. And it was always warnings telling people to leave the area or to avoid the water. Dr. James Westbrook, a linguist from the University of Maine, who studied the echo phenomenon in 1964, documented several instances where visitors' voices returned as what appeared to be words in Passamaquoddy, the language of the local Wabanaki tribe. Westbrook, who had studied indigenous languages of the region for over 20 years, was able to translate several of the echo responses. The translated phrases were remarkably consistent. Westbrook wrote in his research notes, warnings about deep water spirits, instructions to avoid the stone voice during silent times, and references to times when the boundaries between worlds become thin. What made this particularly unsettling was that none of the visitors who reported these echoes had any knowledge of Passamaquoddy language or cultural practices. Westbrook's attempt to record the echo anomalies using professional audio equipment yielded inconclusive results. Recordings made during GAP events captured the visitors' original voices clearly, but showed only ambient ocean sounds where the echoes should have been, despite multiple witnesses confirming that they heard distinct voice responses. Westbrook theorized that the phenomenon might involve selective acoustic transmission that affected human hearing differently than mechanical recording devices. The National Park Service's response to the growing documentation of thunderhole anomalies was swift and decisive. In 1965, park officials reclassified all incident reports related to acoustic anomalies as visitor experience reports rather than scientific documentation. Staff were instructed to explain GAP events as natural variations in acoustic conditions caused by minor geological shifts that occasionally altered the chamber's resonance properties. Dr. Sullivan's research funding was not renewed for a second year, and her preliminary report was never published in peer-reviewed journals. When Sullivan attempted to continue her research using private funding, the National Park Service denied her request for permits to install monitoring equipment at Thunderhole. Park officials stated that permanent instrumentation would compromise the site's natural character and interfere with visitor experience. Sullivan's personal notes, discovered in her papers after her death in 1989, revealed that she had continued to monitor Thunderhole informally for several years after her official research was terminated. Her private observations documented GAP events that occurred with increasing frequency during the late 1960s and early 1970s, suggesting that the phenomenon was becoming more common rather than less. Thomas Morrison's son, Robert, who continued the family's fishing guide business into the 1980s, reported that GAP events had become predictable enough that local guides learned to avoid scheduling tours at Thunderhole during certain atmospheric conditions. "We knew when the silent times were coming," Morrison said during a 1983 interview. "The signs were always the same: unusual stillness in the air, seabirds avoiding the area, and a feeling that something was listening. Tourists didn't understand why we'd suddenly change our route, but we learned it was better to show them Thunderhole when it was behaving normally." Current Park Service policies prohibit detailed documentation of GAP events, and incident reports filed by visitors are not made available to researchers. Park rangers receive training in explaining acoustic anomalies as natural variations, and official park literature makes no mention of the silence phenomenon. Acoustic monitoring equipment was installed at Thunderhole in 1991, but the data collected by this equipment is classified under environmental protection protocols and has never been made public. Independent researchers attempting to study Thunderhole's acoustic anomalies face significant bureaucratic obstacles. Permits for installing monitoring equipment are rarely approved, and researchers who document GAP events through observational methods find that their findings receive little attention from mainstream scientific journals. The phenomenon remains officially unacknowledged, despite consistent witness reports spanning over 6 decades. Visitors to Thunderhole continue to experience GAP events, though park rangers discourage detailed discussion of these incidents. Online forums and social media posts describe encounters identical to those documented in the 1950s and 60s, periods of acoustic silence, echo distortion, and the unsettling sensation of hearing warnings in unknown languages. These modern accounts suggest that whatever causes Thunderhole's periodic silence remains active and continues to interact with human visitors in ways that defy conventional understanding. The granite chamber keeps its secrets beneath the ocean's surface, occasionally choosing silence over thunder, for reasons that no scientific instrument has successfully measured. During these quiet moments, when the sea forgets its own voice, something else speaks through the stone, offering warnings in languages that the heart understands even when the mind cannot translate their meaning. Some boundaries exist where no boundary should be possible. Mount Katahdin rises 5,267 feet above the forests of northern Maine, its granite peak marking the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail and the geographic center of Baxter State Park. Named by the Penobscot tribe as Katahdin, meaning the greatest mountain, this isolated massif stands nearly 2,000 feet higher than any surrounding peak, creating its own weather patterns and microclimates that can shift dramatically within short distances. The mountain's western and southern approaches follow well-established trails through dense boreal forest, but the Hunt Trail, the official Appalachian Trail route to the summit, presents hikers with one of the most challenging climbs in the northeastern United States. Baxter State Park encompasses over 200,000 acres of wilderness that remains largely unchanged since Governor Percival Baxter donated the land to Maine in a series of purchases between 1931 and 1962. Baxter's vision was to preserve this region forever wild, and park management maintains strict policies that limit development and mechanized access. The Hunt Trail, established in 1934, follows a route that ascends Katahdin's southwestern face through terrain that ranges from dense forest at lower elevations to exposed granite slabs and alpine conditions above treeline. The trail's design incorporates natural geographic features that create predictable landmarks for navigation and safety. Hikers encounter distinct elevation zones: the hardwood forest below 2,000 feet, the coniferous zone between 2,000 and 3,000 feet, and the Krumholtz stunted, wind-shaped trees that marks the transition to alpine conditions above 3,500 feet. Weather conditions can change rapidly at different elevations, but these changes typically follow predictable patterns based on altitude, exposure, and atmospheric conditions. What makes the Hunt Trail unique among mountain climbing routes, however, has nothing to do with terrain difficulty or scenic vistas, and everything to do with an atmospheric anomaly that has puzzled meteorologists for over 4 decades. The discovery occurred on September 12, 1967, when Park Ranger James Morrison was conducting a routine trail maintenance inspection with 2 seasonal employees, Robert Chen and David Sullivan. Morrison, a veteran of 12 years with the Park Service, had climbed Katahdin hundreds of times and was intimately familiar with the mountain's weather patterns and seasonal variations. The day's conditions were ideal for late-season hiking: clear skies, light winds from the northwest, and a steady temperature of 58 degrees Fahrenheit, measured at the Katahdin Stream Campground. The crew had reached approximately 3,200 feet elevation in the transition zone between mature spruce fir forest and the sparse Krumholtz that marks Katahdin's tree line, when Morrison experienced what he initially assumed was equipment malfunction. The handheld thermometer he carried for trail condition reports showed an immediate temperature drop from 58 degrees to 35 degrees Fahrenheit as he stepped from one granite ledge to the next. "I thought my thermometer was broken," Morrison wrote in his incident report filed September 14, 1967. "The reading changed so quickly that I assumed the instrument had malfunctioned. But when Chen and Sullivan caught up to my position, they both commented immediately on the temperature change. We could feel it the moment we crossed that invisible line, like walking from a warm room into a walk-in freezer." Morrison's crew spent over an hour documenting the phenomenon, taking temperature readings at various points along the trail. Their measurements revealed a consistent pattern. Air temperature dropped exactly 23 degrees within a horizontal distance of less than 3 feet. The temperature boundary formed a distinct line across the trail that remained stable regardless of wind conditions or time of day. Most puzzling was the precision of the temperature differential, always 23 degrees, never 22 or 24. The thermal boundary appeared to extend beyond the immediate trail area. Chen, whose background included forestry training, noted that vegetation on either side of the line showed characteristics consistent with different climate zones. Trees below the boundary displayed normal late-season foliage for the elevation, while vegetation above the line showed signs of earlier seasonal transition, typical of areas 500 to 800 feet higher in elevation. Park Superintendent William Torres received Morrison's report with initial skepticism, but authorized a follow-up investigation when similar reports began arriving from trail maintenance crews working other sections of the mountain. Over the following 3 weeks, park staff documented the temperature boundary at multiple points around Katahdin's western and southwestern slopes, always at precisely 3,200 feet elevation, always with the same 23-degree differential. Dr. Margaret Westbrook, a climatologist from the University of Maine's Atmospheric Sciences Department, first investigated Katahdin's thermal anomaly in 1969 as part of a broader study of mountain weather patterns in northern New England. Westbrook's research, funded by the National Weather Service, was designed to improve weather forecasting accuracy for high-elevation areas that experienced rapid condition changes. I initially approached this as a straightforward investigation of localized temperature inversion, Westbrook explained in her preliminary report. Mountains commonly create microclimates, where temperature and humidity can vary significantly over short distances. What I found at Katahdin, however, defied every principle of atmospheric physics I had learned in 20 years of meteorological research. Westbrook's team installed temporary weather monitoring stations at various elevations on the Hunt Trail during the summer of 1969. Their data confirmed Morrison's observations with disturbing precision. The temperature boundary existed as a distinct line at 3,200 feet elevation, maintained the same 23-degree differential regardless of ambient conditions, and remained stable throughout different weather patterns and seasonal changes. Most unsettling was Westbrook's discovery that the boundary affected humidity, barometric pressure, and wind patterns, in addition to temperature. Air above the line consistently registered lower humidity and different pressure readings, as if it belonged to a completely different weather system. Wind patterns showed similar discontinuity, with breezes flowing in different directions on either side of the boundary, despite the absence of any topographic features that could explain the change. Local hiking guide Thomas Belanger, who had been leading clients up Katahdin since 1955, described the temperature line with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had experienced it hundreds of times. Every hiker notices it, Belanger said during a 1973 interview with Backpacker magazine. You're walking up the trail feeling comfortable, and then suddenly you need to put on a jacket. It happens to everyone at exactly the same spot, every single time. After a while, you start timing your gear changes based on that line. Belanger's observations revealed additional details about the boundary's effect on human physiology. Hikers consistently reported feeling slightly disoriented when crossing the line, experiencing brief dizziness or a sensation of pressure change similar to rapid altitude gain in an aircraft. Some visitors described the crossing as walking through an invisible wall or stepping into a different season. Perhaps most disturbing were Belanger's accounts of how the temperature line affected electronic equipment. Compasses would deflect slightly when you crossed the boundary, he explained. Digital watches would sometimes reset or show incorrect times. Camera equipment would fog up immediately, even when there was no visible moisture in the air. It's like the electronics couldn't handle the sudden environmental change. Dr. Robert Sullivan, a physicist from Bowdoin College who studied the Katahdin anomaly in 1975, attempted to measure the boundary using sophisticated atmospheric monitoring equipment. Sullivan's research focused on identifying physical mechanisms that could create such a precise thermal discontinuity in an open mountain environment. I found measurable differences in atmospheric pressure, humidity, and even air density between the two sides of the boundary, Sullivan wrote in his research summary. These differences were consistent with altitude changes of several hundred feet, but we were measuring them across a horizontal distance of less than 10 feet. The physics simply don't work for conventional atmospheric phenomena. Sullivan's most significant finding involved infrared satellite imagery obtained from the National Weather Service. High-resolution thermal imaging consistently showed the temperature boundary as a perfect circle, approximately 2 miles in diameter, centered on Katahdin's summit. From space, the boundary appeared as a distinct thermal signature that remained visible across different seasons and weather conditions. Ground-based geological surveys, however, revealed no corresponding physical features that could explain the thermal anomaly. The boundary crossed various terrain types: granite outcroppings, soil-covered slopes, and dense forest, without correlation to any underlying geological formations. Electromagnetic surveys found no unusual mineral deposits or underground structures that could influence local atmospheric conditions. The National Weather Service's response to the growing documentation of Katahdin's thermal anomaly was characterized by bureaucratic deflection rather than scientific investigation. When Dr. Westbrook submitted her preliminary findings for peer review, she received a letter stating that her research had been reclassified as preliminary data and would not be published without additional verification studies that could take several years to complete. Westbrook's application for extended funding to continue her research was denied, with agency officials stating that resources would be better allocated to phenomena with broader meteorological significance. When Westbrook attempted to organize an independent research consortium involving multiple universities, she found that other climatologists were reluctant to participate in studies that had been implicitly discouraged by federal weather agencies. Sullivan's infrared satellite data became unavailable for research purposes in 1976 when the National Weather Service reclassified high-resolution thermal imagery of the Baxter State Park area as restricted data under environmental protection protocols. Researchers seeking access to current satellite imagery of the region are required to submit detailed justifications for their work and undergo security clearance procedures that can take months to complete. Park Service policies regarding the temperature anomaly shifted dramatically in 1977. Staff were instructed to explain the phenomenon as normal mountain weather variations and to discourage detailed discussion of the boundary's precise characteristics. Incident reports documenting the temperature line were reclassified as visitor experience reports rather than scientific observations, and new park literature made no mention of unusual atmospheric conditions on Mount Katahdin. Despite institutional discouragement, independent documentation of the temperature boundary has continued through informal networks of hikers, guides, and outdoor enthusiasts. Social media posts and hiking forums from the past 2 decades describe encounters identical to those reported in the 1960s and 70s. The same precise location, the same 23-degree temperature drop, and the same physiological and electronic effects on visitors. Modern GPS technology has allowed hikers to pinpoint the boundary's location with increasing precision. Coordinates consistently place the temperature line at exactly 3,200 feet elevation, forming what appears to be a perfect circle around Katahdin's peak. This geometric precision, combined with the anomaly's consistency across decades of changing weather patterns, suggests a phenomenon that operates independently of conventional atmospheric processes. Current park management maintains that Mount Katahdin experiences normal mountain weather variations and provides no official acknowledgement of the temperature boundary in visitor information or interpretive materials. Rangers receive training in explaining atmospheric anomalies as natural features of high-elevation environments, and detailed scientific discussion of the phenomenon is discouraged during guided programs. The invisible wall remains at 3,200 feet, marking a boundary that exists without explanation and persists without acknowledgement. Hikers continue to cross the line between one climate and another, stepping through a thermal frontier that divides the mountain into distinct atmospheric zones that should not exist. Some boundaries are drawn by geology, others by weather, and a few by forces that atmospheric science has yet to identify or understand. True north is not a suggestion until it becomes a lie. Petit Manan Point extends into the Gulf of Maine like a granite finger. Its lighthouse, marking one of the most hazardous sections of the Maine coast for maritime navigation. The point sits on the eastern boundary of Acadia National Park, connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of salt marsh and tidal flats that flood during storm surges and extreme high tides. Petit Manan Lighthouse, built in 1855, rises 119 feet above mean high water, making it the second tallest lighthouse in Maine and a crucial navigation aid for vessels traveling between Bar Harbor and the Canadian Maritimes. The surrounding waters contain some of the most treacherous shoals and ledges along the North Atlantic coast. Underwater granite formations extend nearly 2 miles seaward from the point, creating navigation hazards that have claimed over 30 documented shipwrecks since the mid-1800s. The lighthouse's powerful beacon, visible for 19 nautical miles in clear conditions, has guided countless vessels safely through these waters. But the area's reputation for sudden fog banks and unpredictable currents continues to challenge even experienced mariners. Local fishing communities have worked these waters for over 3 centuries, developing an intimate knowledge of current patterns, underwater topography, and seasonal weather variations that allows them to navigate safely, even during periods of poor visibility. This traditional knowledge, passed down through generations of fishermen and boat pilots, relies heavily on compass navigation and dead reckoning techniques that have proven reliable throughout the region's maritime history. The disruption of this fundamental navigation tool at Petit Manan Point, therefore, represents more than a simple technical anomaly. It challenges the basic assumptions that have guided maritime safety in the area for generations. Coast Guard records first documented compass anomalies at Petit Manan Point on August 14, 1961, when the fishing vessel Sarah's Hope reported navigation difficulties while working lobster traps approximately 1 mile northeast of the lighthouse. Captain Robert Morrison, a 30-year veteran of Maine coastal waters, contacted the Coast Guard station at Southwest Harbor to report that his magnetic compass was indicating a bearing of 47 degrees northeast, regardless of his vessel's actual heading. "I've been fishing these waters since I was 16 years old," Morrison told Coast Guard investigators during his formal statement. "I know every ledge, every current, and every landmark, from here to Grand Manan Island. When my compass started pointing toward open ocean instead of magnetic north, I knew something was seriously wrong. But it wasn't just wrong, it was consistently wrong, always showing the same false bearing no matter which direction I was actually facing." Morrison's report triggered a Coast Guard investigation that revealed the compass anomaly extended across a clearly defined geographic area. Survey vessels, equipped with multiple navigation instruments, documented the phenomenon across a circular zone approximately 1/4 mile in radius, centered on Petit Manan Lighthouse itself. Within this zone, magnetic compasses of all types, from simple handheld instruments to sophisticated marine navigation systems, indicated the same false bearing with mechanical consistency. More disturbing was the discovery that the anomaly affected more than traditional magnetic compasses. Electronic navigation systems, including the early GPS receivers that were beginning to appear on commercial fishing vessels, displayed coordinate readings that placed vessels 300 miles inland near the town of Edmundston in New Brunswick, Canada. Radio direction finding equipment showed similar displacement, indicating signal sources that should have been located to the south and west were instead coming from the northeast, toward empty ocean. Dr. Margaret Chen, a geophysicist from the University of Maine, who investigated the Petit Manan anomaly during the summer of 1962, found no geological explanation for the compass disturbance. "I conducted extensive magnetic field measurements throughout the affected area," Chen wrote in her preliminary report. The Earth's magnetic field strength remained consistent with normal values for this latitude and longitude. Whatever was causing the compass deviation was not related to natural magnetic anomalies in the underlying geology. Chen's research revealed that the false bearing of 47 degrees northeast had remained constant since the anomaly was first documented, regardless of seasonal variations in magnetic declination or the 11-year solar cycle that affects global magnetic field strength. The precision and stability of this false reading suggested an artificial rather than natural source, but no known technology could account for the observed effects. Local lobsterman Thomas Belanger, whose family had worked the waters around Petite Manan Point for 4 generations, described the compass anomaly with the practical concern of someone whose livelihood depended on accurate navigation. "You learn to compensate," Belanger explained during a 1968 interview with Down East magazine. "When you're working inside that zone around the lighthouse, you navigate by landmarks and depth readings instead of compass bearings. But it's unsettling, especially in fog conditions when you can't see the lighthouse or the shoreline. Your instruments are telling you one thing, but your experience tells you something completely different." Belanger's account included details that Coast Guard investigators had not included in their official reports. Electronic fish-finding equipment consistently showed false depth readings within the anomaly zone, indicating water depths of over 200 feet in areas where actual depths ranged between 30 and 60 feet. Radio communications with other vessels became difficult or impossible, with transmitted signals apparently being deflected toward the false bearing rather than reaching their intended recipients. Perhaps most unsettling was Belanger's description of how the anomaly affected wildlife behavior. "Seabirds would avoid flying directly over the lighthouse area," he said. "Migrating species that normally used Petite Manan Point as a waypoint during their seasonal flights would make wide detours around the zone, adding miles to their journey rather than following their traditional route over the point." Dr. James Westbrook, an electronics engineer from the Naval Research Laboratory who studied the Petite Manan phenomenon in 1964, approached the investigation from the perspective of electronic countermeasures and signal interference. Westbrook's research focused on identifying artificial sources that could create the observed navigation disruptions across such a wide area. The consistency and precision of the false bearing suggested an active electronic system rather than passive magnetic interference, Westbrook wrote in his classified report. The 47-degree northeast bearing represents a specific vector that points toward coordinates in the North Atlantic, where no known navigation aids or communication facilities exist. This implies either sophisticated spoofing equipment or natural phenomena operating according to principles that current science doesn't understand. Westbrook's investigation revealed that the anomaly affected different types of navigation equipment in subtly different ways, suggesting multiple interference sources operating in coordination. Magnetic compasses showed simple bearing displacement, while GPS systems displayed coordinate errors that followed complex mathematical relationships. Radio direction finding equipment experienced what Westbrook termed vector rotation, where signals from known sources appeared to originate from the false bearing direction. The National Weather Service's response to the growing documentation of navigation anomalies at Petite Manan Point reflected institutional reluctance to acknowledge phenomena that challenged fundamental navigation principles. When Dr. Chen submitted her geological survey findings for publication, she was informed that her research would require additional peer review and security clearance due to its potential impact on maritime navigation safety. The Coast Guard's handling of the situation proved similarly evasive. After the initial investigation documented the compass anomaly, subsequent reports were classified under navigation security protocols that restricted public access to information about maritime hazards. Mariners continued to report navigation difficulties in the area, but these reports were processed through administrative channels that discouraged detailed documentation or scientific analysis. Chen's research funding was terminated in 1965, when the University of Maine was informed that continued study of magnetic anomalies in sensitive coastal areas required federal permits that could take years to obtain. Chen's laboratory equipment was reassigned to other projects, and her research data was transferred to federal archives, where it became unavailable to other investigators. Westbrook's classified report was never released for publication, and his subsequent attempts to organize independent research into electronic navigation anomalies were discouraged by Navy officials who cited national security concerns. When Westbrook retired from federal service in 1978, he was required to sign agreements that prohibited him from discussing his work on navigation system interference with civilian researchers or media organizations. The Petite Manan Compass anomaly was quietly removed from official Coast Guard navigation warnings in 1973, with agency officials stating that improved navigation technology had made the warnings obsolete. Local fishermen and recreational boaters continued to experience compass problems in the area, but these incidents were no longer investigated or documented by federal maritime agencies. Modern GPS technology has provided new insights into the anomaly's characteristics, but also new complications for navigation safety. Satellite navigation systems consistently display coordinate errors within the affected zone, but the nature of these errors has evolved with technological improvements. Early GPS receivers showed simple coordinate displacement, while modern systems display coordinates that place users in locations that don't exist. Grid references that fall in areas of open ocean where no land masses appear on any charts. Commercial fishing vessels now rely on redundant navigation systems when working near Petite Manan Point, using combinations of radar, depth sounders, and visual landmarks to maintain accurate positioning. Coast Guard rescue operations in the area require special protocols that account for false position reports from vessels in distress, adding complexity and delay to emergency responses. The Lighthouse Automation Project, completed in 1987, removed the last resident Coast Guard personnel from Petite Manan Point, eliminating the on-site observers who had informally monitored the compass anomaly for over 2 decades. Automated systems now maintain the lighthouse beacon, but provide no capability for documenting or investigating navigation anomalies that continue to affect vessels in the area. Recent online forums and social media posts from recreational boaters describe navigation experiences at Petite Manan Point that match the patterns documented in the 1960s. GPS systems continue to display false coordinates. Electronic compasses point toward empty ocean, and communication equipment experiences signal deflection that makes radio contact with shore stations difficult or impossible. The false bearing persists at 47 degrees northeast, pointing toward coordinates where no landmark exists and no destination waits. Vessels entering the anomaly zone find their instruments suddenly unreliable, their electronic systems reporting positions that place them hundreds of miles from their actual location. Some directions lead to safe harbor, others to open sea, and one leads to nowhere at all, a bearing that exists only in the compass needle's lie, pointing toward a destination that navigation science cannot explain or cartography cannot chart. Stone should not breathe, but some stone remembers what it means to be alive. Otter Cliffs rise 110 feet above the North Atlantic along the eastern shore of Mount Desert Island, creating some of the most dramatic coastal scenery in Acadia National Park. These granite precipices, formed from the same pink Cadillac granite that defines much of the island's geology, have been carved by millennia of wave action into a complex landscape of sea caves, natural arches, and tidal pools that attract researchers studying both marine ecosystems and coastal erosion patterns. The cliff formation extends below the waterline in a series of underwater ledges and caverns that create hazardous conditions for small boats, but provide crucial habitat for cold-water marine species. Local fishing communities have long avoided the immediate area around Otter Cliffs due to unpredictable currents and submerged rocks. But the protected waters just offshore support populations of harbor seals, various seabird species, and the occasional whale that ventures close to shore while following fish migrations. The cliff's most prominent feature, visible only at low tide, is a horizontal cave entrance approximately 8 feet wide and 4 feet high, located at the base of the granite wall, where wave action has carved a natural tunnel into the bedrock. Unlike most coastal caves, which flood completely during high tide, this particular cavern maintains an air pocket that allows warm air to escape in regular pulses, creating a phenomenon that has puzzled observers since park rangers first documented it in the early 1960s. Marine biologist Dr. Robert Chen first investigated the Otter Cliffs cave system in June 1963 as part of a broader study of intertidal ecosystems in Acadia National Park. Chen's research focused on documenting species diversity in sea caves and tide pools, but his attention was drawn to unusual atmospheric conditions he observed at the cave entrance. I noticed immediately that warm air was flowing from the cave opening, even though the ambient air temperature was only 55 degrees Fahrenheit, Chen wrote in his field notes, dated June 18, 1963. The expelled air felt distinctly warmer than the surrounding environment, and it pulsed in regular intervals that seemed too consistent to be explained by wave action or tidal influences. Chen's initial measurements revealed that air escaping from the cave maintained a constant temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of external weather conditions or seasonal variations. More puzzling was the rhythm of the airflow, exactly 60 seconds between each pulse, with no variation in timing that Chen could detect over several hours of observation. The marine biologist attempted to explore the cave interior using scuba equipment, but found that the tunnel extended beyond the range of his diving lights and seemed to curve downward into the granite bedrock. Water depth within the cave varied with tidal conditions, but never completely filled the passage, allowing the warm air to escape through the upper portion of the tunnel, even during high tide periods. Chen's documentation attracted the attention of Dr. Margaret Sullivan, a geologist from the University of Maine who specialized in coastal geology and underground water systems. Sullivan joined Chen's research team in August 1963, bringing equipment designed to measure temperature, humidity, and air composition in the cave system. The temperature consistency was unlike anything I had encountered in 30 years of studying coastal geological formations, Sullivan wrote in her preliminary report. Air temperature at the cave mouth remained at exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit during a 3-week monitoring period. Despite external temperature variations ranging from 48 to 72 degrees, the precision of this temperature maintenance suggested either an active thermal source or atmospheric conditions that defied conventional understanding of cave environments. Sullivan's chemical analysis of the expelled air revealed another puzzling characteristic. The air contained normal atmospheric ratios of oxygen, nitrogen, and trace gases, with no detectable volcanic gases, geothermal signatures, or unusual chemical compounds that could explain its elevated temperature. The air appeared to be ordinary atmospheric air that had been heated by an unknown source and expelled through the cave system with mechanical regularity. Local park ranger Thomas Morrison, who had worked the Otter Cliffs area since 1958, described the cave's behavior with the practical observation of someone who had monitored it daily for several years. You could set your watch by it, Morrison explained during a 1965 interview with National Geographic researchers. Every minute, on the minute, warm air would flow out of that cave for about 8 to 10 seconds. It happened during storms, during calm weather, at high tide, at low tide, in summer and winter. Whatever was causing it operated like clockwork. Morrison's observations included details that the scientific researchers had not initially documented. He noted that seabirds avoided perching near the cave entrance, despite the abundant nesting sites available on the surrounding cliff faces. Harbor seals, which regularly hauled out on nearby ledges, consistently avoided the waters directly in front of the cave opening. Perhaps most unsettling was Morrison's account of the cave's effect on electronic equipment. Compasses would spin when you held them near the cave mouth during the air pulses, he said. Radio communications got staticky, and camera equipment would sometimes malfunction. It was like the cave was generating some kind of electromagnetic field every time it exhaled. Dr. James Westbrook, a physicist from Bowdoin College, attempted to measure the cave's depth and internal structure using sonar equipment in September 1964. Westbrook's research represented the first systematic effort to map the cave system's dimensions and identify potential sources for the thermal and rhythmic anomalies. The sonar results were completely inconclusive, Westbrook wrote in his research summary. Sound waves directed into the cave simply disappeared without producing echoes or return signals. We attempted measurements using different frequencies and power levels, but in every case, the sound appeared to be absorbed completely by the cave interior. This suggested either an extremely deep cavity or internal surfaces with acoustic properties unlike normal granite formations. Westbrook's team also documented magnetic field variations that coincided with the warm air pulses. Using sensitive magnetometers, they recorded brief but measurable changes in local magnetic field strength that occurred precisely when warm air escaped from the cave. These magnetic variations lasted exactly as long as the air pulses and returned to normal levels during the intervals between exhalations. The research team's most disturbing finding involved seismic monitoring equipment that recorded subtle ground vibrations synchronized with the cave's breathing pattern. The vibrations originated from deep within the bedrock beneath Otter Cliffs and suggested that whatever was causing the air pulses involved mechanical activity far below the cave entrance. The National Park Service's response to the growing documentation of the Otter Cliffs cave anomaly reflected institutional discomfort with phenomena that challenged geological understanding of the region. When Chen and Sullivan submitted their joint research findings for publication in peer-reviewed journals, they were informed that their work required additional review by federal geological agencies before it could be released to the scientific community. Dr. Sullivan's request for extended funding to conduct comprehensive geological surveys of the cliff area was denied, with park officials stating that such research would require extensive excavation that could damage sensitive coastal ecosystems. When Sullivan appealed this decision, she was told that the cave area had been designated as a sensitive research zone, requiring special permits that could take years to obtain. Chen's marine biology research was redirected to other areas of the park, and his documentation of the cave's atmospheric anomalies was removed from the official study reports before publication. Park Service guidelines were established that discouraged detailed scientific investigation of the cave system, with officials stating that excessive research activity could disturb wildlife habitat in the area. Westbrook's sonar and magnetic field data was classified as preliminary geological survey information and transferred to federal archives, where it became unavailable to other researchers. When Westbrook attempted to organize a multidisciplinary research consortium to study the cave phenomenon, he found that other universities were reluctant to participate in projects that had been implicitly discouraged by federal park management. Public access to the immediate area around the cave was quietly restricted beginning in 1966, with park officials citing safety concerns about unstable cliff faces and dangerous wave conditions. Warning signs were installed that prohibited climbing or exploring the cliff areas below the established viewing platforms, effectively preventing independent observation of the cave system. Current park management maintains that the Otter Cliffs area experiences normal coastal geological processes and provides no official acknowledgement of unusual atmospheric or thermal phenomena in park interpretive materials. Rangers receive training in explaining coastal cave systems as natural features formed by wave erosion, with no mention of temperature anomalies or rhythmic airflow patterns. Despite institutional discouragement, informal documentation of the cave's breathing pattern has continued through networks of local residents, park employees, and visiting researchers who observe the phenomenon during routine activities in the area. Social media posts and online forums from the past 2 decades describe encounters identical to those documented in the 1960s. Warm air pulses every 60 seconds, electromagnetic effects on equipment, and the complete absence of sonar echoes from the cave interior. Modern thermal imaging equipment, operated by independent researchers, has confirmed that the cave continues to expel air at exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, maintaining the same temperature precision that puzzled investigators 50 years ago. The mechanical regularity of the 60-second intervals remains unchanged, suggesting that whatever drives the cave's respiratory pattern operates with the consistency of biological processes rather than geological ones. The pulse continues beneath Otter Cliffs, marking time with the rhythm of something that breathes without lungs and exhales without ever drawing breath. The warm air carries no chemical signature to explain its source and disappears into equipment that cannot measure what should be measurable. Some caves echo sound and some absorb it, but this one seems to swallow sound entirely, as if the darkness inside extends beyond the reach of human instruments and into depths where granite remembers older purposes than simple stone. Some paths lead exactly where they should, by routes that should not exist. Grafton Notch State Park encompasses 12,000 acres of mountainous terrain in western Maine, carved by glacial action into a dramatic landscape of steep-walled valleys, cascading waterfalls, and granite peaks that rise over 3,000 feet above sea level. The park straddles the border between Maine and New Hampshire, with the Appalachian Trail following the ridgeline of the Mahoosuk Range through some of the most challenging terrain on the entire 2,190-mile trail system. The Mahoosuk Range itself represents one of the oldest mountain chains in North America, formed during the Devonian period over 400 million years ago, when tectonic forces thrust ancient ocean floor sediments skyward into the jagged peaks that define the region's character today. The area's geological complexity includes formations of schist, granite, and quartzite that create the notch's characteristic narrow valley, a glacially carved passage between Old Speck Mountain to the north and Baldpate Mountain to the south. Indigenous peoples, primarily the Abenaki, used the notch as a travel corridor for thousands of years, following seasonal migration routes between coastal areas and inland hunting grounds. European settlers avoided the region until the mid-1800s, when logging operations began harvesting the area's old-growth spruce and fir. The Appalachian Trail was routed through Grafton Notch in 1937, following survey work conducted by the Appalachian Mountain Club that identified the most practical route through the otherwise nearly impassable terrain. Trail maintenance in this section has always presented unique challenges due to extreme weather conditions, steep grades, and granite formations that make traditional trail construction techniques difficult to implement. The white painted blazes that mark the Appalachian Trail throughout its length require frequent renewal due to weather exposure, but maintenance crews have developed reliable schedules and procedures that ensure consistent trail marking across even the most remote sections. The first documented report of missing trail blazes in Grafton Notch appeared in the Maine Appalachian Trail Club's maintenance log on July 23, 1972. Trail supervisor Robert Morrison noted that white blazes were absent along a section of trail between Grafton Notch State Park's parking area and the ascent toward Old Speck Mountain, a distance that should have contained approximately 26 individual blazes spaced at regulation intervals. I walked the section twice to confirm the absence of blazes, Morrison wrote in his maintenance report. The trail itself was clearly defined and showed evidence of regular foot traffic, but no white paint markings were visible on trees, rocks, or trail signs throughout a section that I measured at 1.3 miles. This represents the longest unblazed section I have encountered in 15 years of trail maintenance work. Morrison's report indicated that blazes were present and properly maintained both before and after the missing section, appearing exactly where GPS coordinates suggested they should be located. More puzzling was his observation that the missing blazes had not been removed by weather or vandalism. There were no traces of old paint or mounting hardware that would indicate previous blaze locations. The Maine Appalachian Trail Club dispatched a maintenance crew to restore the missing blazes on August 5, 1972. Crew leader Thomas Chen and two volunteers, David Sullivan and Margaret Westbrook, arrived at Grafton Notch with paint, brushes, and measuring equipment necessary to establish proper blaze spacing along the unmarked section. Chen's crew report, filed August 7th, documented an experience that challenged their understanding of both trail maintenance procedures and basic navigation principles. We entered the unblazed section at 0800 hours with clear weather and good visibility, Chen wrote. Our plan was to measure and mark appropriate blaze locations at regulation intervals, but we found that standard measurement techniques didn't work in this area. The maintenance crew discovered that distance measurements became unreliable within the unblazed section. Measuring wheels and paste distances provided inconsistent results, with the same section of trail measuring different lengths when traversed in opposite directions. Compass readings fluctuated randomly, making it impossible to maintain accurate directional bearings for blaze placement. Most disturbing was the crew's experience with time passage during their work. We entered the section at 8 a.m. and expected to complete blaze installation in approximately 4 hours, Chen reported. When we emerged at the end of the unblazed area, our watches showed 11:45 a.m., indicating 3 hours and 45 minutes of elapsed time. However, according to our work log, we had installed 43 blazes at proper intervals, which should have required at least 6 hours of work time. Dr. Elizabeth Torres, a geography professor from the University of Maine who studied trail maintenance issues in 1974, investigated the Grafton Notch blaze anomaly as part of a broader research project on wilderness navigation challenges. Torres approached the mystery from an academic perspective that focused on cartographic accuracy and land surveying principles. I found significant discrepancies between official trail maps and the actual terrain in the Grafton Notch area, Torres wrote in her preliminary findings. GPS measurements of the trail route showed consistent coordinates for the beginning and end of the problematic section, but satellite imagery revealed no corresponding trail between these points. It appeared that hikers were traveling between two locations without following any visible path. Torres conducted her own traverse of the unblazed section using professional surveying equipment, accompanied by graduate student Michael Morrison and experienced hiker Jennifer Walsh. Their expedition, undertaken September 15, 1974, was designed to create accurate measurements and photographic documentation of the terrain where blazes could not be maintained. The experience was profoundly disorienting, Torres later explained during a 1976 interview with Backpacker magazine. We had detailed topographic maps, professional-grade GPS equipment, and extensive backcountry experience, but none of our navigation tools functioned reliably within that section. Compasses spun freely, GPS units showed conflicting coordinate readings, and we could not determine our location relative to known landmarks. Despite the navigation difficulties, Torres's team successfully traversed the section and emerged at the predicted coordinates with no memory of being lost or confused during the hike. Their written logs showed normal hiking pace and routine observations about terrain and weather conditions, but their photographs revealed inconsistencies that troubled the research team. Our cameras documented a clear, well-defined trail through forest typical of the elevation and geographic area, Torres said. But when we compared these photographs to aerial imagery and satellite maps, we could not identify the locations where the pictures were taken. The terrain features in our photographs did not match the topography that should exist between our entry and exit coordinates. Local hiking guide Robert Belanger, who had been leading groups through the Mahusuk Range since 1968, described the Grafton Notch Trail section with the practical knowledge of someone who had guided hundreds of hikers through the area. Every experienced hiker knows about the missing blazes, Belanger explained during a 1977 interview. It's not a problem for navigation because the trail is obvious and you always come out where you expect to. But something strange happens in that section. Belanger's account included details that academic researchers had not documented in their formal reports. Hikers consistently reported that their sense of time became unreliable within the unblazed section, with many people expressing surprise at how quickly or slowly they had completed what appeared to be a routine trail segment. Electronic devices, watches, altimeters, and early GPS units frequently displayed incorrect readings or malfunctioned entirely. Groups would enter the section together and emerge together, but individual hikers often reported different experiences of the terrain, weather conditions, or time passage, Belanger said. Some people would describe climbing steep sections that others didn't remember, or crossing streams that weren't there for other members of the same group. But everyone always arrived at the same destination without getting lost. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy's response to the growing documentation of the Grafton Notch anomaly reflected institutional priorities that emphasized hiker safety over scientific investigation. In 1978, trail officials established a policy of adaptive maintenance for the section, acknowledging that traditional blaze installation was not possible, while ensuring that the trail route remained clearly defined through alternative methods. Rather than continuing attempts to install permanent blazes, maintenance crews began using temporary markers, flags, ribbon, and small signs that were replaced seasonally. These markers disappeared regularly, not through weather damage or vandalism, but simply by vanishing overnight during routine maintenance inspections. Dr. Torres's research funding was not renewed after she submitted preliminary findings that described cartographic anomalies requiring additional investigation. When Torres attempted to organize a multidisciplinary research team involving geologists, physicists, and electronic engineers, she found that other universities were reluctant to participate in studies that challenged fundamental assumptions about land surveying and navigation technology. The University of Maine classified Torres's Grafton Notch research as incomplete preliminary data and transferred her files to archived storage, where they became inaccessible to other researchers. Torres's attempts to publish her findings in geography journals were unsuccessful, with peer reviewers noting that her conclusions lacked sufficient supporting evidence and conflicted with established cartographic principles. Trail maintenance records for the Grafton Notch section were redesignated as Special Conditions Documentation in 1981 and removed from standard Appalachian Trail databases. Current trail guides describe the area as unmaintained wilderness section, with warnings about navigation difficulties, but provide no details about the specific nature of these challenges. Modern GPS technology has provided new insights into the trail anomaly, but also new complications for understanding what happens within the unblazed section. Satellite navigation systems consistently show hikers' positions at the beginning and end of the section, but display no tracking data for the intervening distance. GPS logs show gaps in recorded waypoints, as if users had teleported between the entry and exit coordinates without traveling through the space between them. Online hiking forums and GPS tracking applications from the past decade document similar experiences reported by contemporary hikers. Trail GPS tracks uploaded to mapping services show consistent gaps in the Grafton Notch area, with hikers' recorded positions jumping from one coordinate to another without showing the intermediate route. Recent attempts by independent researchers to document the trail section using drone photography and satellite imagery have produced inconclusive results. Aerial photographs show dense forest canopy in the area where the trail should exist, but ground-level exploration consistently reveals a clear, well-maintained hiking route that appears in no photographic or cartographic records. The unblazed section continues to guide hikers between known coordinates through terrain that maps cannot document and cameras cannot record. Travelers enter at one point and emerge at another, following a route that exists in three-dimensional space but leaves no trace in the two-dimensional world of charts and satellite imagery. Some paths can be measured and marked. Others exist only in the walking, leading hikers through landscapes that exist in the space between where they were and where they need to be. Some signals broadcast without permission and receive themselves without explanation. Schutic Point extends into the North Atlantic as the easternmost section of Acadia National Park, separated from Mount Desert Island by Frenchman Bay and connected to the mainland by a narrow peninsula that has served as a strategic coastal observation site for over 2 centuries. The point's granite headlands rise 60 feet above mean high water, providing unobstructed views across 20 miles of open ocean toward the Bay of Fundy and the Canadian Maritime Provinces. During World War II, the United States Navy established a radio communications facility at Schutic Point, taking advantage of the site's isolation and favorable atmospheric conditions for long-range radio transmission. The installation operated from 1942 to 1963, serving as a relay station for submarine communications and coastal surveillance networks that monitored North Atlantic shipping lanes during the Cold War period. When the Navy decommissioned the facility in 1963, the National Park Service assumed management of the property, converting the former military buildings into a marine research station and education center. The site's radio towers and communications equipment were dismantled, but the concrete foundations and underground cable conduits remained, creating what electromagnetic engineers describe as an ideal environment for detecting weak radio signals and atmospheric electromagnetic phenomena. The isolation that made Schutic Point valuable for military communications also attracted civilian radio operators and researchers studying atmospheric radio propagation. The area's distance from urban electromagnetic interference, combined with its coastal location, provided conditions that allowed sensitive radio equipment to detect signals that would be masked by background noise in more populated areas. Amateur radio operator Robert Chen first documented unusual radio transmissions at Schutic Point on March 27, 1968, while conducting propagation tests with equipment borrowed from the University of Maine's Electrical Engineering Department. Chen, whose Federal Communications Commission license authorized him to operate high-frequency radio equipment for educational research, had chosen the site for its reputation among radio enthusiasts as one of the quietest electromagnetic environments on the East Coast. I was monitoring the 28 MHz band for atmospheric skip conditions when I detected a strong carrier signal at exactly 28.7 MHz, Chen wrote in his technical log. The signal appeared at 03:17 hours and lasted for exactly 4 minutes before disappearing. What made this unusual was the signal's strength and stability, which suggested a nearby transmitter, but I knew of no licensed stations authorized to operate on that frequency from this area. Chen's initial assumption was that he had detected a distant amateur radio operator whose signal was being propagated by unusual atmospheric conditions. However, when he attempted to establish two-way communication using standard radio protocols, he received no response. The signal continued for the full 4-minute period, but contained no recognizable voice, code, or digital data transmissions. More puzzling was Chen's observation that the signal caused interference with other electronic equipment in his mobile radio station. His frequency counter, digital clock, and battery voltage meter all displayed the same six-digit number sequence 471983 while the transmission was active. When the signal stopped at exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, all affected devices returned to normal operation. Chen returned to Shudik Point the following Tuesday, March 5, 1968, to determine whether the transmission would repeat at the same time and frequency. His equipment detected the identical signal at 3:17 a.m., with the same duration, frequency characteristics, and electronic interference effects. The consistency suggested an automated transmission rather than human-operated equipment. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, an electrical engineering professor at the University of Maine who specialized in radio frequency propagation studies, joined Chen's investigation in April 1968 after reviewing his technical documentation. Sullivan's research focused on atmospheric effects that influenced long-range radio communications, and she was intrigued by reports of a regular transmission that appeared to originate from an area with no known radio facilities. The signal characteristics were unlike anything in my 20 years of radio propagation research, Sullivan wrote in her preliminary analysis. The transmission showed no frequency drift, phase modulation, or amplitude variations that would indicate conventional radio equipment. It appeared to be generated by a source with stability characteristics superior to anything available in commercial or military radio technology at that time. Sullivan's team conducted systematic monitoring of the 28.7 MHz frequency throughout the summer of 1968, documenting the transmission every Tuesday at exactly 3:17 a.m. Their analysis revealed that the signal strength remained constant, regardless of weather conditions, atmospheric pressure, or seasonal variations that typically affected radio propagation in the coastal environment. Most significantly, Sullivan's direction-finding equipment consistently indicated that the transmission originated from a point approximately 2 miles southeast of Shudik Point, in an area of open ocean where water depths exceeded 300 feet. Attempts to locate the source using boats equipped with radio direction-finding equipment produced inconclusive results, with signal bearings that changed randomly when observers moved to different positions. Thomas Morrison, a former Navy radio technician who had worked at the Shudik Point facility during the 1950s, learned of the civilian research through local contacts and provided historical context that added to the mystery. Morrison revealed that Navy personnel had occasionally detected similar unexplained transmissions during the facility's operational period, but these reports had been classified and never officially investigated. "We called it the Tuesday signal because it was so regular," Morrison explained during a 1969 interview with Sullivan's research team. "It always appeared on the same frequency at the same time, but our equipment couldn't decode any information from it. The signal would cause our frequency standards to drift and our digital equipment to malfunction, so we learned to schedule maintenance around it rather than trying to understand what was causing it." Morrison's account revealed that the Navy had conducted unofficial investigations of the signal during the early 1960s, using specialized electronic warfare equipment designed to analyze enemy radio transmission. These investigations had concluded that the signal exhibited characteristics inconsistent with known radio technology, leading to recommendations that it be monitored but not actively investigated to avoid drawing attention to potentially sensitive military communications research. Local fishing boat captain David Belanger, whose family had worked the waters around Shudik Point for 3 generations, described electronic equipment problems that correlated with the timing of the mysterious radio transmissions. "Every Tuesday morning around 3:30, our fish finder would start showing false readings," Belanger said during a 1970 interview. "Compass heading indicators would spin. GPS units would display coordinates that put us hundreds of miles from our actual position, and radio communications with shore stations would become impossible for about 5 minutes." Belanger's observations suggested that the signal's effects extended beyond radio equipment to include other electronic systems that operated in the area during the transmission periods. His detailed logbooks documented equipment malfunctions that occurred weekly at precisely the same time as Chen and Sullivan's radio monitoring detected the mysterious signal. Perhaps most disturbing was Bélanger's report that the six-digit number sequence, 471983, occasionally appeared on his boat's electronic displays during the transmission periods, despite the fact that his navigation equipment operated on different frequencies than the radio systems being monitored by the research team. This suggested that whatever was generating the radio signal was also affecting unrelated electronic systems through unknown mechanisms. The Federal Communications Commission's response to inquiries about the Scudic Point transmissions reflected bureaucratic confusion rather than deliberate cover-up. When Sullivan submitted technical documentation requesting investigation of unlicensed radio activity, FCC engineers stated that no transmissions were detected on 28.7 MHz during monitoring sweeps conducted from their regional office in Portland, Maine. The discrepancy between civilian reports and official FCC monitoring led to a joint investigation in September 1969, when Commission engineers brought portable radio monitoring equipment to Scudic Point to document the signal firsthand. The results of this investigation were never made public, but FCC records show that the case was transferred to federal agencies with jurisdiction over national security matters rather than routine radio interference complaints. Sullivan's research funding was suspended in January 1970 when university administrators were informed that her work involved classified radio frequencies that required security clearance for continued study. Sullivan's attempts to obtain the necessary clearance were unsuccessful, and her research data was confiscated by federal agents who provided no explanation for their actions beyond citing national security regulations. Chen's amateur radio license was temporarily suspended in 1970 for operating outside authorized parameters, despite the fact that his activities involved passive monitoring rather than transmission. When Chen appealed this decision, he was told that his license would be restored only if he agreed not to conduct further research into unexplained radio phenomena without prior FCC approval. The Scudic Point Research Station was closed to outside investigators in 1971, with park officials stating that increased security measures were necessary to protect sensitive marine research equipment. Access to the point's former military facilities was restricted, and visitors were prohibited from bringing radio equipment or electronic monitoring devices into the area. Morrison, who had provided historical information about Navy experiences with the signal, was contacted by federal investigators in 1972 and advised that his previous statements about classified military communications should be withdrawn. Morrison subsequently refused all requests for interviews and declined to discuss his knowledge of radio phenomena at Scudic Point. Independent monitoring of the 28.7 MHz frequency has continued through networks of amateur radio operators working from locations outside the restricted area, but these efforts have produced inconsistent results. Some operators report continued detection of the Tuesday morning transmission, while others find no unusual activity on the frequency. Modern software-defined radio equipment has provided new capabilities for analyzing weak signals and extracting information from complex transmissions, but attempts to decode the Scudic Point signal have been unsuccessful. The transmission appears to contain no recognizable data patterns, voice communications, or digital information that would indicate its purpose or origin. Recent social media posts from amateur radio operators describe encounters with the mysterious transmission that match the characteristics documented in the 1960s and 70s. The signal continues to appear every Tuesday at 3:17 a.m., still causes interference with electronic equipment, and still displays the same six-digit number sequence on affected devices. The frequency persists at Scudic Point, broadcasting its 4-minute message to an ocean that holds no licensed receivers, and generates interference patterns in electronics that have no theoretical basis for responding to its signal. Each Tuesday morning, the transmission begins exactly on schedule, counting out minutes with mechanical precision before disappearing into electromagnetic silence that reveals nothing about its source or purpose. Some signals carry information, and some carry meaning, but this one seems to carry only time itself, marking the passage of moments with digital precision that serves no detectable function beyond the act of counting. Gravity is constant until it chooses to be otherwise. Cadillac Mountain rises 1,530 feet above the Atlantic Ocean on Mount Desert Island, marking the highest point along the North American coast between Nova Scotia and Florida. The mountain's distinctive pink granite summit, composed of Cadillac granite formed during the Devonian period 400 million years ago, provides the first glimpse of sunrise for the continental United States between October 7th and March 6th each year. The mountain's strategic location made it a crucial navigation landmark for centuries before European settlement, with the Wabanaki peoples using its prominence for seasonal ceremonies and astronomical observations. French explorer Samuel de Champlain named the broader island Isle des Monts Deserts in 1604, referring to the barren appearance of its wind-swept peaks when viewed from the sea. American settlers later designated the highest point Cadillac Mountain in honor of Antoine Lomé de la Motte, Sieur de Cadillac, the French explorer who received a land grant encompassing much of present-day Acadia National Park. The mountain's summit became accessible by automobile in 1931 when the Civilian Conservation Corps completed a 3.5-mile road that winds through dense forest to the exposed granite peak. This road, still the primary route to the summit, attracts over 500,000 visitors annually, who come to experience sunrise from America's easternmost high point and to enjoy panoramic views that extend across Frenchman Bay to the Canadian Maritime Provinces. The summit's popularity among tourists and researchers alike has made it one of the most scientifically monitored locations in Acadia National Park, with weather stations, geological survey markers, and atmospheric research equipment documenting environmental conditions at regular intervals since the 1940s. Dr. Robert Chen, a physics professor from the University of Maine, first documented the Cadillac Mountain weight anomaly on September 14, 1987, during a class field trip designed to demonstrate gravitational variations at different elevations. Chen's exercise, intended as a routine physics demonstration, involved weighing identical objects at sea level and at the mountain's summit to show students the minimal but measurable decrease in gravitational field strength that occurs with increased altitude. The expected weight reduction at Cadillac Mountain's elevation should be approximately 0.04% compared to sea level measurements, Chen wrote in his class notes. When we weighed our test objects at the summit, however, they showed a consistent reduction of 2.3%, nearly 60 times greater than the theoretical gravitational variation for this altitude. Chen's initial assumption was equipment malfunction, but repeated measurements using multiple digital scales produced identical results. Objects that weighed exactly 1 kilogram at the park's visitor center showed readings of 977 grams when weighed within a specific area near the summit marker. The effect appeared consistent across different types of scales and remained stable throughout varying weather conditions. More puzzling was Chen's discovery that the weight reduction occurred only within a precisely defined circular area, approximately 50 feet in diameter, centered on the U.S. Geological Survey benchmark that marks the mountain's official summit. Objects weighed just outside this circle showed normal gravitational readings consistent with the expected altitude variation, while identical objects weighed within the circle consistently displayed the anomalous 2.3% reduction. Chen returned to Cadillac Mountain on multiple occasions throughout the autumn of 1987, accompanied by colleagues from the university's physics department, who brought increasingly sophisticated measurement equipment to document and analyze the phenomenon. Their findings confirmed the original observations and revealed additional characteristics that challenged conventional understanding of gravitational physics. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, a geophysicist who joined Chen's investigation in October 1987, approached the anomaly from the perspective of local geological variations that might influence gravitational field strength. I conducted extensive surveys of the summit area using gravimetric equipment designed to detect mineral deposits and underground cavities, Sullivan explained in her preliminary report. The subsurface geology showed no anomalies that could account for the observed weight variations. The granite formation appeared consistent throughout the area, with no voids, dense ore deposits, or structural features that would create localized gravitational effects. Sullivan's measurements revealed that the anomaly affected gravitational acceleration rather than simply scale calibration. Pendulum experiments conducted within the affected area showed timing variations consistent with reduced gravitational field strength, confirming that the weight reduction reflected actual changes in local gravitational conditions rather than instrument error. Perhaps most significantly, Sullivan discovered that the effect remained constant regardless of tidal forces, seasonal variations, or the positions of celestial bodies that normally influence sensitive gravitational measurements. The 2.3% reduction persisted with mechanical consistency that suggested an artificial rather than natural phenomenon. Local park ranger Thomas Morrison, who had worked at Cadillac Mountain since 1975, described visitor reports of unusual experiences that correlated with the timing of the physics research. People would mention feeling slightly lightheaded or dizzy when they spent time near the summit marker, Morrison explained during a 1989 interview. Some visitors described a sensation of weightlessness or floating that lasted for a few minutes after leaving the immediate summit area. Morrison's observations included details that researchers had not initially documented in their scientific reports. Electronic equipment brought to the summit by tourists, cameras, altimeters, and early GPS devices frequently malfunctioned within the circular area where the weight anomaly was most pronounced. Battery-powered devices would lose power rapidly, and digital displays would show incorrect readings or fail to function entirely. Hiking groups would arrive at the summit with working equipment, but cameras wouldn't operate properly, and altimeters would show impossible elevation readings, Morrison said. The problems were consistent enough that I started advising visitors to check their equipment before entering the summit area if they wanted to take photographs or record elevation data. Dr. James Westbrook, an atmospheric physicist from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, learned of the Cadillac Mountain anomaly through academic networks and conducted independent verification studies during the summer of 1989. Westbrook's research focused on atmospheric phenomena that could influence gravitational measurements, including air density variations and electromagnetic effects. I found no atmospheric conditions that could account for the observed gravitational anomaly, Westbrook wrote in his research summary. Air pressure, temperature, humidity, and electromagnetic field strength, all measured within normal ranges for the elevation and location. The weight reduction appeared to be caused by factors operating independently of conventional atmospheric physics. Westbrook's most significant contribution involved precision timing of the anomaly's effects on mechanical systems. His experiments demonstrated that pendulum clocks ran measurably slower within the affected area, gaining approximately 3 seconds per hour compared to identical timepieces positioned outside the circular boundary. This timing variation provided additional confirmation that the phenomenon involved actual changes in local gravitational field strength. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration's involvement in investigating the Cadillac Mountain anomaly began in 1994, when Dr. Chen submitted his findings to a NASA research program studying gravitational variations that could affect satellite orbital calculations. NASA's interest reflected concerns that unexplained gravitational anomalies might influence the accuracy of GPS systems and other space-based navigation technologies. NASA's first investigation, conducted during the summer of 1994, involved a team of gravitational physicists and aerospace engineers who brought sophisticated measurement equipment to document the anomaly's characteristics with scientific precision that exceeded the capabilities of university research programs. The results of this investigation were classified immediately upon completion, with team members required to sign non-disclosure agreements that prohibited them from discussing their findings. Dr. Sullivan, who had been invited to participate in the NASA investigation as a consulting geologist, was informed that her involvement would require security clearance that could take months to obtain. When Sullivan declined to pursue the clearance process, she was excluded from the investigation, and her previous research data was confiscated for security review. Chen's university research was terminated in 1995 when federal officials informed the University of Maine that continued gravitational studies at Cadillac Mountain required permits from multiple federal agencies, with jurisdiction over national security matters. Chen's attempts to obtain these permits were unsuccessful, and his research files were transferred to federal archives, where they became inaccessible to other investigators. NASA conducted 2 additional investigations of the Cadillac Mountain anomaly in 1999 and 2007. But the results of these studies have never been released to the scientific community. Freedom of Information Act requests, filed by science journalists and academic researchers, have been denied on grounds that the investigations involved atmospheric research protocols with national security implications. Park Service policies regarding the summit area were quietly modified beginning in 1996 to discourage detailed scientific investigation of unusual phenomena. Educational programs that had previously included physics demonstrations were redesigned to avoid activities that might reveal the weight anomaly to student groups. Scientific equipment permits became more difficult to obtain, with researchers required to submit detailed justifications for any studies involving precision measurement devices. The summit marker area was redesigned in 1998 with new viewing platforms and interpretive displays positioned to direct visitor traffic away from the circular zone where the weight anomaly was most pronounced. Park literature began emphasizing Cadillac Mountain's scenic and historical significance, while minimizing references to scientific research conducted at the summit. Modern digital scales brought to Cadillac Mountain by independent researchers and curious visitors continue to register the 2.3% weight reduction within the original 50-foot diameter circle. Online forums and social media posts from the past decade describe experiences identical to those documented by university researchers in the late 1980s. Objects losing weight with mathematical precision, electronic equipment malfunctioning, and visitors experiencing brief sensations of altered gravity. GPS satellite data from the summit area shows subtle but persistent anomalies in orbital calculations, with navigation systems requiring regular correction factors to maintain accuracy when providing location services for the mountain's peak. These corrections are implemented automatically by GPS software and remain invisible to most users, but they reflect continuing gravitational variations that affect space-based positioning systems. The weight anomaly persists at Cadillac Mountain summit, creating a circular zone where mass becomes negotiable, and objects surrender 2.3% of their substance to forces that conventional physics cannot explain. Visitors stand within this invisible boundary, unaware that they weigh slightly less than they should, while their cameras fail to record and their instruments refuse to measure what gravity has chosen to forget. Some mountains hold their mass with certainty, but this one allows a small portion to drift away, as if 50 feet of Granite Peak exists in a gravitational field that follows different rules than the rest of the world. Light travels at constant speed until it arrives 17 seconds too late. Pemaquid Point extends into the Gulf of Maine as a dramatic granite peninsula that has claimed over 40 documented shipwrecks since European settlement began in the early 17th century. The point's distinctive stratified rock formations, created by ancient metamorphic processes that compressed and folded sedimentary layers into striking geometric patterns, rise nearly 40 feet above mean high water and provide one of the most photographed coastal landscapes in New England. Pemaquid Point Lighthouse, built in 1827 and rebuilt in 1857, stands 38 feet tall on the highest section of the granite headland. The lighthouse's distinctive white tower and attached keeper's house have guided vessels safely through the treacherous waters between Muscongoose Bay and Johns Bay for over 160 years, its beacon visible for 14 nautical miles in clear conditions. The area's maritime history stretches back over 4 centuries, with archaeological evidence indicating that European fishermen established seasonal camps at Pemaquid Point as early as 1620. The region's strategic location between major coastal rivers made it a crucial waypoint for colonial trade and military operations. But the same geography that provided shelter for friendly vessels also created navigation hazards that trapped unwary mariners among the submerged ledges and tide-swept rocks that extend nearly a mile seaward from the point. Local fishing communities developed an intimate knowledge of the point's unique characteristics over generations of working these dangerous waters, including observations about optical phenomena that seem to affect visibility and shadow patterns during specific weather conditions and times of day. Dr. Robert Chen, an optics researcher from the University of Maine, first documented the Pemaquid Point shadow anomaly on August 15, 1986, while conducting routine measurements of lighthouse beacon effectiveness for the Coast Guard's Lighthouse Automation Program. Chen's work involved precisely timing the relationship between the lighthouse's rotating beacon and the shadows cast by its tower structure to optimize automated light patterns. I noticed immediately that the lighthouse's shadow did not correspond exactly with the position of the structure itself, Chen wrote in his technical report. Using high-speed photography, I documented a consistent delay between the lighthouse's actual position and the location of its shadow on the surrounding granite surfaces. The delay measured 17 seconds regardless of the sun's angle or the time of day. Chen's initial assumption was that unusual atmospheric conditions were causing light refraction that displaced shadow positions relative to their sources. However, repeated measurements over several days revealed that the shadow lag remained constant across varying weather conditions, humidity levels, and atmospheric pressure readings that would normally influence optical refraction. More puzzling was Chen's observation that the phenomenon affected only shadows cast by the lighthouse structure itself. Shadows cast by other objects in the immediate area, people, equipment, vehicles, displayed normal timing relationships with their sources. The 17-second delay appeared to be specific to the lighthouse tower and its attached buildings. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, a physics professor specializing in optical phenomena who joined Chen's investigation in September 1986, brought sophisticated timing equipment designed to measure light propagation with nanosecond precision. Sullivan's research focused on identifying atmospheric or environmental factors that could cause localized delays in light transmission. The shadow lag defied every principle of optical physics I had studied in 30 years of research, Sullivan wrote in her preliminary analysis. Light travels at constant speed in any given medium. Shadows form instantaneously when objects block light sources. The 17-second delay suggested either that light was being slowed by unknown atmospheric conditions, or that the lighthouse was casting shadows through some mechanism other than simple light blockage. Sullivan's measurements confirmed that the delay occurred consistently across different types of light sources. The lighthouse shadow showed the same 17-second lag when illuminated by sunlight, artificial floodlights, and even camera flashes. This consistency ruled out atmospheric refraction or solar-specific phenomena as explanations for the anomaly. Perhaps most unsettling was Sullivan's documentation of brief periods when multiple shadows of the lighthouse appeared simultaneously on the surrounding granite. During sunset conditions, when shadow lengths changed rapidly due to the sun's low angle, observers could see both the lighthouse's current shadow position and its 17-second delayed shadow, creating duplicate images that suggested the structure existed in two slightly different temporal states. Thomas Morrison, who served as lighthouse keeper at Pemaquid Point from 1972 to 1984, before automation eliminated the position, described optical phenomena that he had observed but never formally reported during his 12 years at the station. The lighthouse shadow always seemed wrong somehow, Morrison explained during a 1987 interview. You'd look at the tower, then look at its shadow, and they didn't quite match up. It was like the shadow was always trying to catch up to where the lighthouse actually was. Morrison's account included details about the shadow anomaly's effect on daily routine activities at the lighthouse station. I learned not to rely on shadow positions for timing, he said. If I used the lighthouse shadow to estimate the time of day, I'd consistently be about 15 or 20 seconds off. It was easier to use shadows cast by other structures or objects that behave normally. More disturbing was Morrison's description of visitors' reactions to the shadow phenomenon. People would notice it without being told about it, he said. They'd stand near the lighthouse taking photographs and then look confused or disoriented. Some visitors mentioned feeling like something was off about the lighting, but they couldn't explain exactly what seemed wrong. Local photographer David Belanger, who had been documenting Pemaquid Point's scenic landscapes for commercial and fine art purposes since 1975, noticed the shadow anomaly through his professional work with time-lapse photography. I was creating sunrise and sunset sequences at the point when I discovered that the lighthouse shadows moved differently than everything else in the frame, Belanger explained during a 1988 interview. Belanger's time-lapse footage, recorded using professional motion picture equipment, provided visual documentation of the shadow lag that was visible to casual observers. You could see the lighthouse shadow hesitating, like it was reluctant to follow the building's movement, he said. In fast motion sequences, the delay became obvious. The shadow would lag behind for exactly 17 seconds, then jump forward to catch up with where it should be. Perhaps most unsettling was Belanger's observation that the shadow anomaly affected photographic equipment in subtle but consistent ways. Automatic exposure systems would malfunction near the lighthouse during certain lighting conditions, he said. The cameras seemed to be reading light levels based on where the shadows should be, rather than where they actually were, resulting in consistently overexposed or underexposed images. Dr. James Westbrook, a chronometry specialist from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, investigated the Pemaquid Point anomaly in 1989 as part of research into environmental factors that could affect precision timing systems. Westbrook's work focused on identifying natural phenomena that might influence atomic clock accuracy in coastal environments. The 17-second shadow delay represented a temporal anomaly that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between cause and effect, Westbrook wrote in his classified report. If shadows consistently lag behind their sources by a fixed time interval, this suggested that either light propagation was being affected by unknown physical forces, or that time itself was flowing differently in the immediate vicinity of the lighthouse. Westbrook's investigation revealed that the shadow lag corresponded with subtle variations in radio wave propagation that affected navigation equipment used by vessels approaching Pemaquid Point. Radio direction finding equipment showed timing discrepancies that matched the 17-second delay observed in optical phenomena, suggesting that the anomaly affected electromagnetic radiation across multiple frequency ranges. The National Institute of Standards and Technology's response to Westbrook's findings reflected concern about the implications for precision timing systems used in navigation and communications. When Westbrook submitted his preliminary report for peer review, he was informed that his research had been classified under provisions related to national security applications of chronometry technology. Chen's lighthouse automation work was reassigned to other Coast Guard personnel in 1990, with agency officials stating that the Pemaquid Point installation required specialized technical considerations that fell outside normal lighthouse maintenance procedures. Chen's research data was transferred to federal archives and became unavailable for continued analysis. Sullivan's optical physics research was terminated when the University of Maine was informed that her work involved sensitive timing phenomena that required security clearance for continued study. Sullivan's attempts to obtain the necessary clearance were unsuccessful, and her laboratory equipment was reassigned to other projects that did not involve temporal measurement studies. Morrison, who had provided historical information about the lighthouse's operational characteristics, was contacted by federal investigators and advised that his observations about unusual phenomena should be considered classified information related to navigation safety. Morrison subsequently declined all requests for interviews about his experiences at Pemaquid Point. The lighthouse was fully automated in 1991, with modern LED lighting systems and GPS synchronized timing controls that operate without on-site personnel. Visitors' access to the immediate lighthouse area was restricted through the installation of barriers that prevent close approach to the tower structure, ostensibly for safety reasons related to cliff erosion and wave conditions. Current lighthouse operations manuals make no mention of optical anomalies or shadow timing phenomena, describing Pemaquid Point as a standard automated navigation aid that operates according to conventional lighthouse technology principles. Maintenance crews receive no briefing about unusual characteristics of the installation beyond routine safety and equipment protocols. Independent documentation of the shadow lag has continued through networks of photographers and amateur researchers who observe the phenomenon during visits to the area. Digital photography and video recording technology have provided new capabilities for documenting the 17-second delay, with online forums sharing imagery that confirms the persistence of the optical anomaly. Recent analysis of satellite imagery shows timing inconsistencies in shadows cast by the lighthouse structure that are visible from space, suggesting that the phenomenon affects light propagation across a wide range of observation distances and angles. These satellite observations remain archived in databases that are not accessible to civilian researchers. The 17-second shadow continues to trail behind Pemaquid Point Lighthouse, marking time with a delay that suggests light itself travels differently through this particular section of the Maine coast. Visitors photograph the lighthouse against granite cliffs, without realizing that its shadow remembers where it was rather than showing where it is, creating visual documents of a place where cause follows effect after a precisely measured pause. Some shadows follow their sources with mechanical obedience, but this one seems to require 17 seconds to consider where it ought to be, as if even light must hesitate before committing to the laws of physics. The ocean writes its own messages, but the language changes with every tide. Bar Harbor sits on the northeastern shore of Mount Desert Island, its protected waters forming a natural harbor that has sheltered vessels for over 4 centuries. The town's waterfront extends along a complex shoreline of granite ledges, cobble beaches, and extensive tidal flats that expose thousands of tide pools during low water periods. These pools, carved into the metamorphic rock by millennia of wave action, support diverse marine ecosystems that have attracted researchers and naturalists since the 1800s. The area's tidal range, averaging 11 feet between high and low water, creates dramatic changes in shoreline topography every 6 hours. During extreme low tides, rocky areas that remain submerged most of the time become accessible to visitors. revealing tide pools that range from shallow depressions holding a few gallons of seawater to deep basins over 10 feet across that maintain their own complex food webs between tidal cycles. Bar Harbor's position, relative to the Gulf of Maine's major current systems, creates unique hydrodynamic conditions that influence sediment, transport, nutrient distribution, and the formation of distinctive geological features along the shore. The combination of granite bedrock, glacial deposits, and constant wave action has created one of the most scientifically studied intertidal zones on the North American coast, with marine research stations documenting ecological changes for over a century. The town's maritime history includes centuries of fishing, shipping, and later tourism that brought increasing numbers of observers to the shoreline, creating an extensive informal record of unusual phenomena that occurred in the tidal zone but fell outside the scope of conventional scientific documentation. Dr. Margaret Chen, a marine biologist from the College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, first documented unusual formations in the town's tide pools on June 22, 1979, during routine surveys of intertidal species distribution. Chen's research focused on seasonal variations in marine organisms that inhabited different zones of the rocky shore, requiring detailed observations of tide pool conditions throughout the year. I discovered what appeared to be text impressions in the sandy sediment at the bottom of several tide pools, Chen wrote in her field notes. The impressions were clearly defined, showing what looked like words or symbols arranged in linear patterns. The formations were too precise and organized to be natural erosion patterns, but I could identify no mechanism that would create such markings in underwater sediments. Chen's initial photographs of the impressions proved inconclusive, showing only ordinary sand patterns, without the clear text markings that were visible to direct observation. Repeated attempts using different cameras, lighting conditions, and film types consistently failed to record the impressions despite their obvious presence to multiple observers who examined the tide pools during the same low tide periods. More puzzling was Chen's discovery that the text impressions appeared in what seemed to be multiple languages, including recognizable patterns that resembled English, French, and what appeared to be Native American syllabic writing. The variety of linguistic styles suggested either multiple sources or a single phenomenon that manifested differently across various tide pool locations. The impressions lasted exactly one tidal cycle, remaining clearly visible throughout the low tide period, but disappearing completely when the pools filled with incoming seawater. When the same pools were exposed during the next low tide, the text impressions were gone, replaced by ordinary ripple patterns in the sand. Dr. Robert Sullivan, a linguistics professor from the University of Maine who studied the Bar Harbor text impressions during the summer of 1980, approached the phenomenon from an academic perspective, focused on identifying the languages and deciphering potential meanings of the markings. Sullivan's expertise in northeastern Native American languages made him particularly interested in the syllabic patterns that Chen had observed. The text impressions showed characteristics consistent with multiple writing systems, Sullivan wrote in his research notes. I identified patterns that appeared to be English words, French phrases, and what looked like Mi'kmaq hieroglyphic writing. The linguistic diversity suggested either coincidental formation of letter-like shapes or a phenomenon that somehow interfaced with multiple cultural and linguistic traditions. Sullivan's attempts to create plaster casts of the impressions were unsuccessful, as the casting material obscured the fine detail that made the text recognizable to direct observation. Underwater photography, using scuba equipment, produced the same negative results as Chen's surface photography images, showing only normal sediment patterns without the clear text formations that were visible to unassisted human vision. Perhaps most intriguingly, Sullivan documented several instances where visitors to the tide pools claimed they could read and understand text written in languages they didn't recognize. Multiple witnesses reported that they understood the meaning of text impressions in what appeared to be foreign languages, Sullivan noted. When I asked them to translate or explain what they had read, they provided consistent interpretations that suggested the text contained warnings about tidal conditions, weather changes, or navigation hazards. Local resident Thomas Morrison, whose family had lived in Bar Harbor for 5 generations, described the tide pool text phenomenon as part of local oral tradition that extended back to his great-grandfather's time in the late 1800s. The old-timers called them tide warnings, Morrison explained during a 1981 interview. They said the pools would show messages during certain tidal conditions, always in languages that visitors could somehow understand, even if they'd never seen those languages before. Morrison's account included details about the timing and conditions that produced the text impressions. The messages appeared most often during new moon low tides in late spring and early summer, he said. Local fishermen learned to check certain tide pools before heading out, because the text would warn about storms or dangerous seas that weren't obvious from normal weather signs. More unsettling was Morrison's description of how the phenomenon affected visitors' behavior. People would find the tide pools with text in them and spend hours trying to understand what they were reading, he said. Some visitors became obsessed with returning during every low tide, convinced that the messages contained important information meant specifically for them. We had to rescue several tourists who got trapped by incoming tides because they were too focused on reading the pool bottoms to notice the water rising. Dr. James Westbrook, an oceanographer from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, who investigated the Bar Harbor tide pool anomaly in 1982, focused on identifying physical mechanisms that could create organized patterns in underwater sediments. Westbrook's research examined current flows, wave action, and biological activity that might produce formations resembling written text. I found no oceanographic processes that could account for the observed text impressions, Westbrook wrote in his preliminary report. Sediment transport in tide pools follows predictable patterns based on water flow and wave energy. The formations documented by previous researchers would require controlled manipulation of sediment particles that doesn't occur through natural marine processes. Westbrook's investigation included analysis of water samples, sediment composition, and current patterns within the affected tide pools. His findings revealed normal marine chemistry and physics, with no anomalous conditions that could explain the formation of organized text patterns in underwater sediments. Most significantly, Westbrook confirmed the photographic anomaly reported by earlier researchers. Professional underwater photography equipment consistently failed to record the text impressions that were clearly visible to direct observation, he noted. This suggested that the phenomenon involved visual perception rather than physical alteration of sediment patterns. But multiple independent observers reported seeing identical text formations, ruling out individual hallucination or misperception. The National Park Service's response to documentation of the Bar Harbor tide pool phenomenon reflected institutional reluctance to acknowledge reports that challenged conventional understanding of marine processes. When Chen submitted her findings for publication in marine biology journals, editors requested additional photographic evidence that Chen was unable to provide due to the consistent failure of camera equipment to record the text impressions. Sullivan's linguistic analysis was never published after university administrators expressed concern that reports of unexplained text phenomena could damage the credibility of the linguistics department's other research. Sullivan's documentation was archived in university files, where it became inaccessible to other researchers without special permission that was rarely granted. Westbrook's oceanographic study was terminated when Woods Hole officials determined that continued investigation of unsubstantiated visual phenomena fell outside the institution's research priorities. Westbrook's preliminary findings were not submitted for peer review, and his research data was transferred to administrative archives. Local access to the tide pools, where text impressions were most frequently observed, became increasingly restricted during the 1980s with park officials citing concerns about visitor safety and protection of sensitive marine habitats. Educational programs that had previously included tide pool exploration were modified to focus on areas where unusual phenomena were not typically reported. Current interpretive materials for Bar Harbor's intertidal zone make no mention of text impressions or unusual formations in tide pool sediments, describing the area as a typical example of North Atlantic rocky shore ecology. Park rangers receive no training regarding unusual visual phenomena and are instructed to explain any visitor reports of text formations as natural erosion patterns or biological activity. Despite institutional discouragement, informal documentation of tide pool text impressions has continued through networks of local residents, visiting researchers, and amateur naturalists who observe the phenomenon during routine tide pool exploration. Online forums and social media posts from recent years describe encounters that match the characteristics documented in the 1970s and 80s. Clear text visible to direct observation, but unphotographable. Multiple languages, including some that observers shouldn't be able to read, but somehow understand. Modern digital photography has provided no solution to the documentation problem, with high-resolution cameras and underwater equipment producing the same negative results as film photography from previous decades. The text impressions remain visible only to direct human observation, suggesting a phenomenon that interfaces specifically with human visual perception rather than electromagnetic radiation that cameras detect. The tide pools continue their silent correspondence along Bar Harbor's shore, writing messages that cameras cannot see and creating text that readers understand without translation. Each low tide reveals new words pressed into sand by forces that marine science cannot identify, offering warnings and information in languages that somehow transcend the barrier between recognition and comprehension. Some writing preserves meaning across time, but these messages exist only in the moment of observation, disappearing with the next tide, and leaving no record except in the memory of those who learn to read what the ocean chooses to say. Some waters forget what lies beneath, but others insist on remembering. Flagstaff Lake stretches across 20,000 acres of western Maine's mountainous terrain. Created in 1950, when the Long Falls Dam flooded the Dead River Valley to generate hydroelectric power for the region's growing industrial needs. The artificial lake submerged the entire community of Flagstaff, including homes, businesses, roads, and a railroad line that had served the area's logging industry for over 70 years. Before the flooding, Flagstaff Village supported nearly 300 residents who worked in timber harvesting, river driving, and the railroad operations that transported logs to mills downstream. The community included a general store, post office, school, and several churches that served families whose roots in the valley extended back to the 1840s. When the state announced plans for the hydroelectric project, residents received compensation for their property and were required to relocate before the controlled flooding began. The valley's topography, carved by glacial action and millennia of river erosion, created ideal conditions for reservoir construction. Steep hillsides contained the impounded water within well-defined boundaries, while the valley floor's gentle gradient allowed for maximum water storage with minimal environmental disruption to surrounding areas. Engineers calculated that the reservoir would reach full capacity 18 months after dam completion, permanently submerging all traces of the former community beneath over 60 feet of water. The lake's remote location in the Bigelow mountain range, accessible only by logging roads and seasonal hunting camps, meant that few people observed its behavior during the years immediately following its creation. The area's isolation attracted occasional fishermen and hunters, but sustained human presence remained minimal throughout the reservoir's first decades. Park Ranger Robert Chen first documented the unusual stillness phenomenon at Flagstaff Lake on September 19, 1973. during a routine patrol of the area's fish and wildlife populations. Chen, whose responsibilities included monitoring water quality and fishing conditions at several remote lakes in western Maine, had arrived at Flagstaff Lake before dawn to conduct early morning surveys when fish activity was typically highest. At approximately 0600 hours, the lake surface became completely motionless, Chen wrote in his incident report. Despite steady winds of 10 to 15 miles per hour that had been creating normal wave patterns throughout the night, the water suddenly became as smooth as glass and remained that way for exactly 12 minutes. During this period, the lake's surface reflected not the sky or surrounding mountains, but what appeared to be the landscape that existed before the valley was flooded. Chen's detailed description documented his observation of buildings, roads, and other structures visible in the lake's reflection that did not correspond to any features of the current landscape. I could see what looked like houses, a main street with storefronts, and even individual trees that appeared to be growing in locations now underwater, he wrote. The reflection was so clear and detailed that I could make out architectural features and read what appeared to be signs on some of the buildings. The phenomenon lasted precisely 12 minutes, ending abruptly when normal wind patterns resumed and the lake surface returned to its typical wave-disturbed state. Chen noted that the reflections disappeared instantly when the stillness ended, replaced by ordinary reflections of sky and clouds that corresponded to the actual overhead conditions. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, a limnologist from the University of Maine, who studied northern New England lake systems, investigated Chen's report during the summer of 1974. Sullivan's research focused on the ecological development of artificial reservoirs and the environmental changes that occurred as flooded areas stabilized into new aquatic ecosystems. I confirmed Ranger Chen's observations during my third visit to Flagstaff Lake on August 20th, 1974, Sullivan wrote in her field notes. The complete stillness occurred exactly as described, beginning at dawn on the third Tuesday of the month and lasting for 12 minutes. During this period, the lake surface acted as a perfect mirror, showing what appeared to be the pre-flooding landscape in remarkable detail. Sullivan's scientific background led her to approach the phenomenon systematically, bringing underwater photography equipment and surface measurement instruments to document the stillness event. Her findings revealed that the lake's surface achieved a mathematical flatness that exceeded the precision of laboratory-calibrated optical equipment, with no measurable wave activity across the entire 20,000-acre surface. Most significantly, Sullivan's underwater photography during the stillness period captured images of submerged structures that corresponded exactly with the buildings and roads visible in the lake's surface reflections. The underwater photographs showed the actual remains of Flagstaff Village, in their current state, deteriorated, covered with aquatic growth, and recognizable only as geometric shapes on the lake bottom, she noted. But the surface reflection showed these same structures as they appeared before flooding, complete and intact. Thomas Morrison, whose family had lived in the original Flagstaff Village before the flooding, learned of the phenomenon through local contacts and visited the lake in October 1974 to observe the reflection firsthand. Morrison, who had been 12 years old when his family was relocated, possessed detailed memories of the village layout and could identify specific buildings and landmarks. I recognized everything, Morrison said during a 1975 interview. My family's house, the general store where my father worked, the schoolhouse where I attended classes, they were all there in the reflection, looking exactly as they did before the flooding. I could see details that I hadn't thought about in 25 years, like the paint color on Mrs. Henderson's front door and the wooden sign outside the post office. Morrison's account included disturbing observations about the reflection's accuracy. The buildings didn't just look like they did when we left, they looked like they would have looked if we had never left, he said. I saw additions to houses that were never built. businesses that were planned but never opened, and improvements to roads that were discussed but never completed. It was like I was seeing what the village would have become if it hadn't been flooded. Local fishing guide David Belanger, who had been bringing clients to Flagstaff Lake since the early 1960s, described his experiences with the monthly stillness phenomenon from the perspective of someone who had observed it regularly over several years. The first time it happened, I thought something was wrong with the weather, Belanger explained during a 1976 interview. You don't expect a large lake to become perfectly calm in the middle of a windstorm, but that's exactly what occurs every third Tuesday at dawn. Belanger's observations revealed that the phenomenon affected more than just the lake's surface appearance. Fish behavior changed completely during the stillness periods, he said. They would stop feeding and swimming, just hanging motionless in the water, like they were part of the reflection. Electronic fish finding equipment would malfunction, showing readings that suggested we were fishing over dry land instead of deep water. Perhaps most unsettling was Belanger's description of how the reflection affected visitors' emotional responses. People would become very quiet during those 12 minutes, he said. Some clients would start crying without explanation, especially if they were from families that had lived in the area before the flooding. It was like they were mourning for something they had never lost, or maybe remembering something that had never happened. The Maine Department of Environmental Protection's response to documentation of the Flagstaff Lake phenomenon reflected institutional priorities focused on water quality and ecological monitoring, rather than unexplained optical effects. When Sullivan submitted her findings for publication in limnology journals, state officials requested that her research focus on measurable environmental parameters rather than visual phenomena that could not be quantified through conventional scientific methods. Sullivan's underwater photography, which provided objective documentation of the correlation between submerged structures and surface reflections, was deemed inconclusive by peer reviewers, who noted that the images showed only the expected remains of the flooded village. The fact that these remains corresponded with the detailed reflections observed during stillness periods was dismissed as coincidental pattern recognition rather than evidence of anomalous optical phenomena. Chen's Park Service reports were reclassified as subjective observations in 1977 and removed from official incident databases. When Chen attempted to bring other rangers to witness the phenomenon, he was reassigned to different patrol areas that did not include Flagstaff Lake. Park Service policies were established that discouraged detailed documentation of unusual natural events that fell outside standard wildlife and environmental monitoring protocols. Morrison's historical knowledge of the original village was deemed irrelevant to current lake management needs, and his requests to participate in research studies were declined. State historians showed no interest in oral history accounts that related to submerged communities, focusing instead on documented historical sites that remained accessible for conventional archaeological study. The lake's remote location made independent research difficult, but occasional visitors continued to document the monthly stillness phenomenon through informal networks of hunters, fishermen, and outdoor enthusiasts familiar with the area. These accounts, shared through local newspapers and outdoor magazines, described experiences consistent with the original observations: perfect stillness, lasting exactly 12 minutes, surface reflections showing the pre-flooding landscape, and emotional responses that suggested psychological connections to the submerged community. Modern GPS technology has provided new insights into the phenomenon's characteristics, with satellite positioning systems showing anomalous readings during the stillness periods. GPS units consistently display coordinates that place users at locations corresponding to the original village streets and building sites, despite their actual positions on the lake surface. These coordinate errors persist for exactly 12 minutes before returning to accurate readings when normal wave conditions resume. Underwater archaeological surveys conducted by the state in the 1990s documented the current condition of structures remaining on the lake bottom confirming that the village ruins exist in deteriorated states consistent with 5 decades of submersion. However, these surveys made no reference to the surface reflection phenomenon and included no analysis of the correlation between submerged structures and the detailed images visible during monthly stillness periods. Recent social media posts and online forums describe encounters with the Flagstaff Lake reflection that match the characteristics documented in the 1970s. Visitors continue to report seeing intact buildings and landscapes that exist only in the 12-minute mirror that appears each month, showing a village that remembers itself as it was and might have been. The lake maintains its monthly appointment with stillness, transforming each third Tuesday dawn into a window that reflects not light, but memory. For 12 minutes, the water forgets its role as reservoir and remembers its purpose as witness, showing visitors a community that exists complete and whole in the space between what was lost and what was never given the chance to be. Some reflections show the world as it is, but this one insists on showing the world as it should have remained, preserved beneath the surface, in a mirror that refuses to reflect anything but the truth of what lies below. The edge of the world exists in two places at once, and neither location matches the maps. West Quoddy Head juts into the North Atlantic as the easternmost point of the continental United States, a windswept granite promontory where the first rays of sunrise touch American soil each morning. The headland rises 90 feet above the Bay of Fundy's treacherous waters, crowned by West Quoddy Head Light, a candy-striped lighthouse that has guided mariners through these fog-shrouded seas since 1808. The surrounding coastline consists of dramatic cliffs carved from ancient volcanic rock, creating a landscape of natural arches, sea stacks, and tide pools that stretches north toward the Canadian border. The area's position at the convergence of major ocean currents creates some of the most unpredictable weather conditions on the North American coast. Warm Gulf Stream waters meet the cold Labrador Current just offshore, generating dense fog banks that can appear without warning and reduce visibility to mere yards within minutes. These atmospheric conditions, combined with the region's extreme tidal range of over 20 feet, have made West Quoddy Head a crucial navigation landmark for centuries of maritime commerce between New England and the Canadian Maritimes. The lighthouse itself stands 83 feet tall, its distinctive red and white stripes making it visible against the often gray Atlantic sky. The beacon's range of 18 nautical miles has prevented countless vessels from foundering on the underwater ledges and hidden rocks that extend far from shore. Local maritime history records speak of ships' officers using the lighthouse not only for navigation, but as a reference point for weather observation, noting that atmospheric conditions visible from the headland often differed significantly from those experienced just miles inland or offshore. Dr. Margaret Chen, an atmospheric physicist from the University of Maine, first documented the double horizon phenomenon at West Quoddy Head on October 14, 1978, while conducting research on coastal weather patterns for the National Weather Service. Chen's study focused on the unique meteorological conditions created by the convergence of warm and cold ocean currents, which produced microclimates that could vary dramatically within small geographic areas. At approximately 1400 hours, I observed what appeared to be two distinct horizontal lines where the ocean surface met the sky, Chen wrote in her field notes. The lower horizon appeared normal, marking the expected boundary between sea and atmosphere at approximately 2.9 degrees below eye level from my observation point. However, a second, fainter horizon was visible approximately 3 degrees above the first, creating what looked like a double exposure effect in the distant sky. Chen's initial assumption was that she was observing a superior mirage, a well-documented atmospheric phenomenon that occurs when warm air overlays colder air, creating optical illusions that can make distant objects appear elevated above their actual positions. However, Her meteorological instruments showed atmospheric conditions that were not conducive to mirage formation, relatively uniform temperature, and humidity readings with no significant thermal layering. More puzzling was Chen's observation that the upper horizon displayed weather conditions that did not match those visible at the normal horizon line. The lower horizon showed clear skies extending to the east, consistent with the high-pressure system that was dominating regional weather patterns, she noted. But the upper horizon showed what appeared to be storm clouds and precipitation that had no correlation with current meteorological conditions or weather forecast models. The phenomenon lasted approximately 45 minutes before the upper horizon gradually faded and disappeared, leaving only the normal ocean sky boundary visible. Chen attempted to photograph the double horizon using professional meteorological documentation equipment, but her images showed only a single horizon line, despite the clear visibility of two distinct boundaries to direct observation. Robert Morrison, the lighthouse keeper at West Quoddy Head from 1965 to 1982, described the double horizon as a recurring phenomenon that he had observed but never formally reported during his 17 years at the station. It happened maybe once or twice a month during certain weather conditions, Morrison explained during a 1984 interview. Usually in the afternoon when the wind was light and the fog was just starting to form offshore. You'd see the regular horizon where the water meets the sky, and then another line above it that showed completely different weather. Morrison's account included details about the practical implications of the phenomenon for maritime navigation. Ship's officers would radio the lighthouse, asking about weather conditions they could see in the distance that didn't match what we were observing from shore, he said. They'd report storm systems or clear skies that corresponded to the upper horizon rather than actual local conditions. It created confusion for navigation and weather routing decisions. Perhaps most disturbing was Morrison's description of how the upper horizon affected radio communications. During the times when both horizons were visible, we'd receive radio transmissions that seemed to be coming from weather stations reporting conditions that matched the upper horizon rather than the real one, he said. Weather reports describing storms that weren't happening, or clear skies when we were experiencing fog and rain. Local fishing boat captain Thomas Belanger, whose family had worked these waters for 4 generations, described encounters with the double horizon phenomenon that affected both navigation and fish-finding operations. You'd be heading toward what looked like clear weather at the normal horizon, but your instruments would be reading conditions that matched the upper horizon instead, Belanger explained during a 1985 interview. Belanger's observations revealed that the phenomenon influenced more than visual perception. Electronic navigation equipment would show depth readings and current information that corresponded to the weather patterns visible at the upper horizon rather than actual local conditions, he said. Fish-finding sonar would indicate species and water temperatures that made sense for the weather system shown in the upper horizon, but not for what was actually happening at sea level. Most unsettling was Belanger's report that crew members experienced physical sensations that matched the atmospheric conditions visible at the upper horizon. If the upper horizon showed storm weather, crew members would feel barometric pressure changes and report symptoms of approaching rough weather, even when local conditions were calm, he said. Some men would become seasick in flat, calm seas if the upper horizon showed storm conditions. Dr. James Westbrook, an optics researcher from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who investigated the West Quoddy Head phenomenon in 1986, approached the mystery from the perspective of atmospheric refraction and light propagation in complex meteorological environments. Westbrook's research focused on identifying natural mechanisms that could create the observed visual effects. I conducted extensive measurements of atmospheric density, temperature gradients, and humidity layers during several documented occurrences of the double horizon, Westbrook wrote in his preliminary report. The atmospheric conditions showed no characteristics that would support conventional mirage formation or other recognized optical phenomena. The double horizon appeared to be caused by factors operating outside established principles of atmospheric optics. Westbrook's investigation revealed that the upper horizon remained stable and clearly defined, even during periods of atmospheric turbulence that should have disrupted any optical illusion based on air density variations. The phenomenon showed persistence and clarity that suggested a genuine additional horizon rather than a distorted view of the existing ocean-sky boundary. Most significantly, Westbrook's spectroscopic analysis of light coming from the upper horizon showed different characteristics than light from the normal horizon, indicating that the two visible boundaries were reflecting or transmitting electromagnetic radiation from different sources. The light from the upper horizon contained spectral signatures that did not match the sun angle or atmospheric conditions present at the observation site, he noted. The National Weather Service's response to documentation of the West Quoddy Head double horizon reflected institutional reluctance to investigate phenomena that challenged conventional meteorological understanding. When Chen submitted her findings for publication in atmospheric science journals, editors requested additional photographic evidence that Chen was unable to provide due to the consistent failure of camera equipment to record the upper horizon. Chen's research funding was not renewed after she insisted on continued investigation of what agency officials termed subjective visual phenomena that fell outside the scope of standard meteorological research. When Chen appealed this decision, she was informed that resources would be better allocated to studies with practical applications to weather forecasting and maritime safety. Morrison's lighthouse logs, which contained informal references to the double horizon phenomenon, were removed from Coast Guard archives during the lighthouse automation process in 1982. Official records show no documentation of unusual visual phenomena at West Quoddy Head, and automated lighthouse systems include no provisions for reporting or monitoring optical anomalies. Westbrook's research was classified after he submitted preliminary findings that described atmospheric optical effects with potential implications for navigation system accuracy. His subsequent attempts to organize independent research into similar phenomena at other coastal locations were discouraged by federal agencies, citing national security concerns related to maritime navigation technology. Access to optimal observation points at West Quoddy Head became increasingly restricted during the 1990s, with park officials citing safety concerns about cliff erosion and dangerous wave conditions. Viewing areas were redesigned to direct visitor attention away from sections of coastline where the double horizon was most frequently observed. Current interpretive materials for West Quoddy Head State Park make no mention of unusual atmospheric or optical phenomena, describing the area as America's easternmost point, with standard lighthouse and coastal ecosystem information. Park rangers receive no training regarding unusual visual effects and are instructed to explain any visitor reports of optical anomalies as normal atmospheric conditions or optical illusions. Despite institutional discouragement, informal documentation of the double horizon has continued through networks of local residents, maritime personnel, and amateur astronomers who observe the phenomenon during routine activities at the headland. Online forums and photography websites from recent years include descriptions of encounters that match the characteristics documented in the 1970s and 80s. Two distinct horizon lines showing different weather patterns, with the upper horizon visible only to direct observation but not to camera equipment. Modern satellite imagery occasionally shows atmospheric anomalies in the West Quoddy Head area that correspond with reported double horizon sightings, but these images are archived in meteorological databases that are not accessible to civilian researchers. Weather monitoring stations in the area continue to report occasional discrepancies between predicted and observed atmospheric conditions that suggest the persistence of unexplained meteorological phenomena. The double horizon continues to appear at America's easternmost edge, offering glimpses of weather that exists somewhere else, conditions that belong to a different ocean under a different sky. Visitors stand at the continent's boundary, unaware that they are seeing through to atmospheric patterns from another location entirely, watching storms and sunshine that may be happening hundreds or thousands of miles away, or perhaps nowhere at all. Some horizons mark the edge of what is visible, but this second line seems to mark the boundary of what should be possible, showing observers weather from a world that exists just beyond the limits of their own.